A 4-meter-tall creature with claws capable of tearing through a fortress wall drowned in a 1.5 foot of water in 2 minutes, because it couldn't swim. And the man who lured it there wasn't even a warrior. He was a floating structures engineer. And the world where he had been cast adrift hadn't yet realized what that meant. But there were still 3 days to go before that. Let's go back to the beginning. Han Do-yeon opens his eyes and sees 2 suns above him. One is white. The second is yellower and lower on the horizon. Wet pebbles scratch his back. Water laps at his feet. His head throbs as if he'd been hit on it with a piece of rebar. He sits up. 300 meters to his left, a village is on fire. A real one. Thatched roofs. A wooden palisade. The fire is devouring the houses one by one. People are running from the village toward the lake. About 30 people. And behind them, something long, black, and many-legged is creeping across the field. Flat like a giant centipede, only wider. Its mouth opens on 3 sides at once. The creature catches up to a limping woman. She is carrying a child. She falls. The sound is not a scream. All the air escapes from her at once. The child rolls across the ground. The creature doesn't even slow down. It keeps going. And then something shifts inside Do-yeon. Not heroism, not rage. Something cold and mechanical. He stares intently at the lake. Gray water, 200 meters wide, at least 4 meters deep toward the center. The shore is gentle, reeds along the edge, a bundle of logs on the sand. And right between his temples, a text unfolds. Calm and even, like a line on a blueprint. Marine Engineering, Level 1, Accessible. A bundle of logs, 4 by 4, an anchor weight, a 20-meter rope made of reeds. Do-yeon blinks. The text hangs before his eyes, transparent as a watermark. He shifts his gaze to the shore where people are screaming and dying, then back to the water. 4 meters deep, a gentle entrance, reeds for binding, logs nearby. He stands up. His knees are shaking, but his hands already know what to do. Hands always know before the head. 6 years of designing floating structures, thousands of hours of calculations. All of it condenses into a single action. He grabs the first log and drags it toward the water. The system responds. A rope made of reeds appears right at his feet. He ties the knots he's tied 1,000 times on models. A square knot, a figure 8. The logs settle on the water and hold. A 4 by 4 platform. Crooked. Pitiful. But it floats. Do-yeon jumps on. It rocks but doesn't tip over. It can hold 5 more. He turns around. 3 have run to the water. An old woman, a man with a gash on his forehead, a girl of about 10. Do-yeon holds out his hand. Get in. The man pushes the girl in first, then the old woman. He jumps in last and nearly capsizes the whole thing. Do-yeon barks. Sit down. Wait in the center. 3 more are running from the shore. A young woman with a boy and an old man with a stick. The creature is already 100 meters from the water. Do-yeon pushes off with his stick. The platform creeps toward the shore. Slowly. Too slowly. The old man stumbles and falls on all 4s. The creature comes ashore. Its paws dig into the pebbles. Huge. 4 meters long. Its shell is black as wet asphalt. No eyes. And then it stops right at the water's edge. Its front paws touch the lake and pull back. It hisses. A low, gurgling sound like a boiling sewer. Do-yeon commits it to memory. It doesn't go into the water. It's afraid of water. He pulls the boy in, then the woman. The old man hangs on the edge. 8 people, the limit. The creature paces along the edge like a dog on a leash, back and forth. Then it turns and heads back toward the burning village. Doyon exhales. His palms are scraped raw. The reeds have left furrows like sandpaper. The old woman whispers something in an unfamiliar language, but he recognizes the tone. Gratitude and fear. He looks at the lake. It is vast. He doesn't know where he is, doesn't know what kind of world this is, doesn't know who these people are. But he knows one thing. Water holds. Water always holds if you distribute the load correctly. Tomorrow, he'll build a second platform. The day after tomorrow, a third. His hands are already counting. 3 hours, and the creature hasn't returned. Doyon jumps into the shallows and walks along the shore. He counts his steps. He measures the depth with a stick. The reeds are tall, their stems as thick as a finger. They'll make ropes and mats. He finds clay, gray and rich. Clay is plaster. Clay is a kiln. He returns and pounds his chest. Doyon, Doyon, Doyon. The man with the gash on his forehead replies, Pek Chang-su, the old woman. Park Woo-sun, the woman with the boy, Im Ha-yeon. The language turns out not to be entirely foreign. The words cling to something in his head as if he'd heard them long ago. By evening, he understands every third word. By morning, every second. The system helps. The language flows into him like water into a sponge, faster than possible. Another oddity in the far corner of his consciousness. At night, he covers the old woman and the girl with reeds. He sits on the edge himself and listens to the shore. The moon is alone. It soothes. He could have survived 2 suns. 2 moons would have broken him completely. A screech comes from the southeast. Maybe a creature. Maybe several. They don't approach the water. The water is safe. He repeats this 5 times and falls asleep. Morning of the second day. The girl shakes him by the shoulder and points to the shore. There stand people. 6 of them. Ragged and dirty. Refugees. New ones. Doyon looks at his own 8, then at these. 14 people on 4 squares. It's not a matter of kindness. It's physics. The platform will tip over. He calls out to Chansu, "Help!" The 2 of them jump into the water. By lunchtime, the second platform is ready. He ties the 2 together. The area is 4 by 8. 14 people will fit on 16 squares, and there will still be room for a fire pit. Day 2. No food, no roof, no fire. But everyone is alive, and the system in his head flickers. M. Marine construction. Progress. The bar shifts by a hair's breadth. People live on his structure. The system sees this. The system counts this. By evening, Doyon does 3 things. He repairs a woven basket and lowers a fishing trap into the water. He assembles a filter from clay shards, sand, pebbles. The murky water passes through and becomes clearer. And he makes fire. He strikes a piece of dark metal with flint. The spark is weak. The reeds burn poorly. But an hour later, a small flame burns in the center of the platform. 14 people look at it as if it were a miracle. They take turns drinking the first boiling water from a single shard. It tastes of clay and smoke. Doyon drinks last. The best water of his life. The third day begins with a scream. Chansu stands at the edge and points to the shore. A creature is coming out of the water. Not that one. Another. Much bigger. 4 meters long, 1.5 meters tall, a body like a mole blown up 100 times. Broad paws, claws curved downward. A mouth like an excavator bucket opens from the bottom up. Terran. That's what they're called. A burrowing creature. The Terran sniffs the air and enters the lake, up to its belly. It stands and stares at the platform. 30 meters between them. Any further and it would have to swim, and these creatures can't swim. The first one pulled its paws back. This one went deeper. Panic on the platform. Im Ha-yeon covers her son's eyes. The old woman whispers a prayer. The girl freezes like a rabbit. Do-yeon thinks, quickly. The creature is standing in the water, so it isn't afraid of it. It just doesn't move in it. It will retreat deeper. It will reach shallower water. He grabs 3 empty gourds. He ties rotten meat to a hook. The hook to a rope. The rope to the gourds. He throws it all into the water 20 meters downwind. The scent will draw the Terran. The gourds sway. The Terran turns its head. Its nostrils flare. It walks toward them. It's hard. The water hinders it, but the scent draws it on. And Do-yeon holds the second rope. It goes underwater toward the shore, to where, at night while everyone was still asleep, he had laid a reed seine in the shallows, a net weighted with stones. The Terran the gourd. Its mouth opens wide. The meat vanishes. Do-yeon yanks the rope. The net rises. Not upward, to the side. Reeds wrap around its hind legs. The stones pull it down. The creature struggles, but in the water it is clumsy. Its claws rake the sand but find no grip. The net tightens. Terran falls onto his side. His head goes underwater. He thrashes. He stirs up a wave. The platform rocks so hard that the old woman cries out, and Do-yeon stands there counting. 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, 2. Bubbles, a spasm, silence. Terran lies face down in the shallows, dead, drowned in 2 minutes. A 4-meter-long, burrowing creature with claws capable of tearing through a fortress wall, drowned in 1.5 meters of water because it couldn't swim. Absolute silence on the platform. The old woman looks at Do-yeon and whispers 2 words. Mr. Hunter. Do-yeon wipes his hands on his pants. He is not a hunter. He is an engineer. Tomorrow they will build another platform, because this one won't hold everyone. The old woman doesn't understand half the words, but she gets the gist. This man knows what to do. On the 4th day, 9 more people arrived, a family of 5, father, mother, 3 children, small, smaller, smallest, and 4 men, young, strong, former militiamen from Manwo Fortress, which fell 3 weeks ago. One of them had a sword, a real one, steel, rusty but steel. Do-yeon looked at the sword and thought that steel was more useful to him now as a tool than as a weapon, but he didn't say that out loud. The militiamen were named Nam Tae-gil, Cho Won-sik, Ryu Sang-hyun, and the youngest, Kang Jae-ho. Tae-gil was the oldest, about 35, a face carved from stone. He looked at the platform. He looked at Do-yeon. He asked who was in charge here. Do-yeon said there was no one in charge. There was a man who was building. Tae-gil snorted. He looked at the dead Terran on the fam. The creature had already started to stink. He asked who had killed him. Do-yeon said the Terran had drowned. Tae-gil stared at him for a long time. Then he said that this was the first time in his life he'd seen a Terran drown. He'd seen Terrans hacked to pieces with swords for 20 minutes. He'd seen them scorched by fire magic. He'd seen one tear down a wall 3 meters thick. But he'd never seen one drown. Do-yeon shrugged. Water. Tae-gil nodded and asked no more questions. 23 people. 2 platforms, 16 square meters each. Cramped. Dirty. Cold at night. Do-yeon realized that organization was needed. Not authority, not hierarchy, just order. Who cuts the reeds? Who hauls the logs? Who tends the fire? Who checks the traps? He gathered everyone on the central platform. He spoke slowly because the language still came with difficulty. The words came, but the grammar was shaky. He explained simply. We need 3 things: water, food, a roof. We have water, the lake, the filter works. Food, the traps yield fish. Not enough. We need more traps. We need to look for edible plants on the shore. A roof. We need a shelter. Reeds and vines. Who knows how to weave? 3 hands went up. Old woman Park Uson, Im Hayon, and one of the militia, Ryu San-hyung. He blushed when they looked at him. He said his mother was a basket weaver. Doyeon nodded and appointed him foreman of the shelter. The next 4 days were work. Pure, monotonous work. Doyeon built, from morning till night, the 3rd platform, 4th, 5th. Each one went together faster than the last because he had perfected the process. 4 logs, 8 crossbeams made of thin trunks, reed binding at 12 points, an anchor weight of 3 stones tied together with rope. The 1st platform took 6 hours to assemble. The 5th took 2.5. Chansu worked nearby, silently. He did as he was told. He didn't ask why. Tegel posted his militiamen on watch. 2 on the shore during the day, 2 at night. They took turns with the sword. Doyeon didn't argue. Let him. Defense wasn't his area. His area was what was underfoot. On the 7th day, he did the math. 5 platforms. 40 square meters of living space on the water. 23 people. Almost 2 square meters per person. Not much, but no longer critical. The fishing traps yielded 4 or 5 fish a day. Small ones, but protein is protein. The filter worked steadily. A reed canopy covered the central platform. At night, it was almost warm under it. The system in Doyeon's head was responding. The progress bar was creeping along, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. 23 people live on his structures. 23 person days per day. 161 in a week. Not enough for the 2nd level. But there is progress. Doyeon was in no hurry. He knew that the 1st level was the foundation. It had to be done right. Reed ropes rot in 3 weeks, so the reeds need to be dried before weaving. Logs without the bark stripped off get covered in slime after 10 days, so stripping the bark is essential. Stone anchors slide down the muddy bottom, so he needs anchors with a hook. He carved the 1st hook anchor from a tree branch, 2 curved knots like claws, a stone weight tied to the fork. The design was primitive, but it clung to the bottom and didn't slide. Little things, all small things, but small things make up a system. On the 10th day, 3 things happened. First, more people arrived, 7 of them, from another village, further to the east. They had walked for 3 days. They'd heard from someone that people lived on the lake, on the water. It seemed crazy, but they came because they didn't want to die on land. Among them was a boy of about 15, skinny, eyes like an adult's. He looked at the platforms and said it looked like a big turtle lying on the water. Doyeon smiled. His first smile in 10 days. 2nd. Tegel came to him in the evening, sat down next to him on the edge of the platform, feet in the water. He was silent for a minute. Then he said that people were asking who Doyeon was, where he was from, why he spoke strangely, why he knew things that no one else knew. Doyeon thought about what to say. He couldn't tell the truth, that he's from another world, that he died and woke up here, that there's a system in his head that gives him materials from thin air. It sounds like the ravings of a madman, or like heresy. He said he'd come from far away, from the coast. They build on water there. That's his trade. Tegel nodded. He didn't believe it, but he accepted it. In this world, every refugee has a story they'd rather not tell. Third, the trap didn't catch a fish. Doyon pulled out the basket in the morning and found something strange inside. A stone, but not an ordinary one. Smooth, black, the size of a fist. Warm. The stone was warm even though it had been in the water all night. Doyon held it in his hands. The system flashed. New text. Element detected. Lake core. Level unknown. Application. Structural reinforcement. Build into the platform's foundation. Doyon looked at the stone, then at the lake. Something lies at the bottom. Something that produces such stones. He put the core in his pocket and told no one. Second week, 30 people, 6 platforms. Doyon switched from a linear arrangement to a circular one. The platforms stood in a row like train cars, and that was wrong. A long line sways on the waves. The load goes to the outer joints and tears them apart. Doyon remembered how he had designed circular pontoon piers for the cooperative in Tonyon. A closed loop distributes the wave load evenly. There is no weak link. He rearranged them. 6 platforms in a circle, open water in the center, about 3 meters in diameter, like a courtyard, only instead of ground, there's a lake. You can fish right from the center. The children were thrilled. They hung over the edges and splashed water. For the first time in 2 weeks, Doyon heard children's laughter. The sound was strange, out of place, beautiful. He built the lake's core at night, when everyone was asleep. He took out a stone, warm, pulsing, as if alive. The system told him where, to the central node, where all 6 platforms converge. He dove into the water, cold, dark. He found the rope knot connecting the platforms by touch. He pressed the stone against it. The stone was absorbed, literally. It entered the wood like water into a sponge. It vanished. Doyon surfaced. He caught his breath. He looked at the platforms. Nothing had changed, visually. But under his feet, he felt the difference. The structure had become stiffer. Not brittle stiff like stone, but resilient stiff, like good steel. The ropes no longer creaked. The logs didn't rub against each other. Everything was one, monolithic. The system had been updated. Marine construction, level 1. Bonus. Structural strength increased by 40%. Doyon lay down on the platform and, for the first time in 2 weeks, felt something resembling confidence. Not joy, not triumph, just a quiet feeling that he was on the right path. Third week, 36 people, 9 platforms. The ring had expanded. Doyon began to designate specific zones. 2 platforms were residential. 1 was for supplies. They dried fish and stored reeds there. 1 was for water filtration. There were 4 filters and a clay vat for boiling, and 1 he called a shipyard to himself, a work platform. There he assembled new modules. The tools were meager, a stone axe, a bone knife, a metal shard that Tegil had sharpened into a makeshift chisel. But Doyon got used to it. His hands adapted. His calluses grew as thick as the sole of a shoe. His back ached every morning, but every morning he got up and built. On the 19th day, a larger group came ashore, 11 people. Among them was a woman with a bag slung over her shoulder, short, thin, her hair tied in a bun. Her face was tired, but her eyes were lively. She looked at the platforms. She looked at the people on them. Then she asked if there were any sick people here. Doyon said the child had had a fever for 3 days. The woman nodded. She asked to be let in. She climbed onto the platform. She opened her bag. There were herbs inside, dried, in small bundles. She sniffed each one. She chose 3. She ground them in a stone bowl. She added water. She stirred it. She gave the child a drink. By evening, the fever had subsided. Her name was So Minji, a former apprentice to an apothecary from Huachan Fortress. Huachan had fallen 8 months ago.
Minji had been walking ever since. 8 months on foot through territory infested with gisu. Alone. With a bag of herbs and a knife. Doyon asked why she was walking alone. Minji looked at him calmly. She said she wasn't alone. At first, there were 32 of them. Then there were fewer. She said nothing more. Doyon didn't ask any further questions. Minji stayed. She didn't ask for permission. She just stayed. The next morning, she was already examining the old people, checking their teeth, feeling their bellies, applying poultices. The old woman, Park Uson, said her knee had been hurting for 20 years. Minji rubbed the knee with an ointment made from some kind of bark. The old woman gasped. Then she stood up and walked across the rim, without limping. For the first time in 20 years. She looked at Minji as if she were a goddess. Minji said it wasn't a miracle, just the right bark. Doyon watched her. She worked quietly, methodically, without fuss. Every movement was precise. Every decision was quick. She reminded him of the surgical nurses in Korean clinics, calm as water, efficient as a machine. In the evening, he approached her. He said he wanted to build her a separate platform for the patients, so that the infected wouldn't lie next to the healthy ones. Minji looked at him. For the first time all day, her expression changed. Something flashed in her eyes. Surprise, or gratitude, or something else for which there was no name. She said that would be the right thing to do. Doyon nodded and went to count how many logs were needed. A month. The first month. Doyon counted the days with notches on the central log. 30 notches, 9 platforms, 47 people. The ring held. The filters worked. The traps yielded fish. The canopy sheltered them from the rain. Minji treated the sick. Tae-gil guarded the shore. Chang-su hauled logs. San-hyun wove shelters. The system was showing progress. There was still a long way to go to reach the second level, but the bar was moving, every day, every man-day. Doyon stood at the edge of the platform on the evening of the first month and looked out at the lake. The sunset was orange. Both suns were setting at the same time, one slightly to the left of the other. Beautiful. Behind him, 47 people were having dinner. Fish, boiled grass that Minji had identified as edible, hot water. Someone was laughing. Dalsu's child was running across the platforms, and his mother was yelling at him not to run. An ordinary evening. An ordinary life. On the water. Doyon thought that a month ago he had drowned on a bridge in Busan. And now he was standing on a raft in another world, listening to other people's children laugh. He didn't understand what he was feeling, but his hands weren't shaking. For the first time in a month, his hands weren't shaking. The second month began with Doyon thinking seriously about food for the first time. Catching fish with traps is survival, not life. 5 or 6 small fish for 47 people. Everyone gets 2 or 3 pieces. That's enough to keep from dying. Not enough to work. People were growing weak. Chansu, who used to haul logs like a feather, started stopping every 10 minutes. The children were acting out from hunger. The old man who never revealed his name lay on the platform and wouldn't get up. Minji said that if nothing changed, problems would start in 2 weeks. Serious ones. Doyon knew she was right. He thought about it every evening. Fish, plants. We need a farm. A floating farm.
He knew how it worked. In Busan, he had designed aquaculture platforms for mussels. The principle was simple: a floating frame, a net inside the frame, substrate on the net. You plant whatever you want in the substrate: mussels, seaweed, or, if it's freshwater, plants. Lettuce, radishes, anything that grows fast and doesn't need soil. Hydroponics, only without electricity or pumps. Passive hydroponics. Roots in water, stems in the air. Sun from above. 2 suns are even better. The problem was the seeds. Doyon didn't have any seeds. The system didn't provide seeds. The system provided building materials, logs, ropes, stone, not food. He asked the residents, who had what? Im Hayon rummaged through her bag and pulled out a small bundle. Inside the cloth were seeds, radishes, green onions, and something else that Doyon didn't recognize. Hayon said they were for the bosses, leafy greens. They grow fast. Doyon took the bundle and felt something rise in his throat. This woman had been running from monsters with a child in her arms, and she had brought seeds with her. Not gold, not weapons. Seeds. He said, "Save Bo."
Hayon shrugged and said that her grandmother always used to say, "A hungry man will take a sword. A wise woman will take seeds."
Doyon spent 3 days building the farm. A frame made of thin tree trunks, 2 by 3 meters. A reed mat, dense, fine meshed. He laid a layer of moss on the mat. He found the moss on the north shore. Damp, thick, the perfect substrate for hydroponics. He pressed the seeds into the moss, a palm's width apart. He tied the frame to the edge of the circular platform on the south side. There's more sun there. Then he scooped up lake water in a shard and watered it. That's it. Now to wait. Radishes sprout in 5 days. Green onions in 7. Bosam in 10. If they sprout. If the soil is right. If the 2 suns of this world provide the correct spectrum. A lot of ifs. Doyon was used to them. An engineer lives in a world where half the variables are unknown. The main thing is to know which variables are critical and which are not. On the 5th day, green sprouts emerged from the moss. Doyon stood over the farm and looked at them. Tiny, pale, as thin as a hair, but alive. The radishes had sprouted. He called for Hayon. She came. She looked. She crouched down. She touched a sprout with her finger. And she cried. Quietly, without a sound. Tears streamed down. Dalsu ran up and asked why Mom was crying. Hayon wiped her face and said she wasn't crying, just the wind in her eyes. There was no wind. Doyon turned away and went to build a second farm. By the 2nd week of the 2nd month, he had built 3 farms. Each was 2 by 3 meters, 6 square meters of planting area each. 18 square meters in total. Not enough for 50 people, but it was a start. The radishes began forming roots on the 12th day, faster than on Earth. The 2 suns were doing their job. Photosynthesis took longer. The daylight hours lasted 16 hours. Minji tasted the first radish and said it was bitter. Doyon said that being bitter was normal. Bitter meant a lot of mustard oil. It's an antiseptic. It's good for you. Minji looked at him and said he was the first person in her life who enjoyed bitter radishes. By the end of the 2nd month, the population had surpassed 60. People were coming. Rumors spread across the territories faster than Gisu. People live on the lake, on the water. The beasts can't reach them. There's a roof. There's fish. There's a doctor. Doyon understood that population growth was both a salvation and a problem. Every new person meant extra hands.
But every new person meant another mouth to feed. The balance was fragile. He calculated every day: fish consumption, water consumption, filter capacity, platform area per person, load on the anchors, numbers in his head. Always numbers. He fell asleep with numbers and woke up with them. The 12th platform was special. Doyon built it separate from the ring, off to the side, about 15 meters away. He connected it to the main structure with a long bridge. It was the Minji Hospital. 2 sections, one for regular patients, cuts, bruises, colds, the second for the contagious, fever, cough, anything that could be transmitted. A reed partition between the sections. Minji inspected the structure and said nothing. She simply began arranging her herbs on the shelves that Doyon had carved out of bark. She worked in silence. Doyon stood on the bridge and watched her move. Precise, economical, not a single unnecessary gesture. Then she turned around and said thank you. 1 word. Doyon nodded and left. He stopped on the bridge, stood there for a second. Then he walked on. He had 3 more platforms to go today. Midway through the 2nd month, Kang Jae-ho, the youngest of the militiamen, came to Doyon with a question. He said he'd seen tracks on the south bank, big ones, not a taran's, something else, wider, deeper, with furrows on the sides, as if the creature had been dragging a tail or heavy. Doyon went with him. They took a boat, not a real boat, a bundle of logs with a side rail, but it floated, and they could row it with sticks. On the south bank, Doyon saw the tracks. Jae-ho hadn't exaggerated. Each track was the size of a wagon wheel, 15 centimeters deep in the ground. The creature was heavy, very heavy. The furrows on the sides were even, not a tail, something else. Doyon followed the tracks to the edge of the forest. There they disappeared into the thicket. He had no intention of going back into the forest, but he remembered the information. Something on land larger than a taran. That meant defending the coast wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. He returned and spoke with Tehegil. Tehegil said that based on the description, it sounded like a growworm, a siege-type gisu, the size of a house, armor that ordinary steel can't penetrate. Only hunters of rank B and above could kill them. Doyon asked how many hunters were here. Tehegil looked at him. 0. There are 0 hunters here. Militiamen aren't hunters. They have no magic, no strength. They know how to keep formation and swing a sword. That's enough against small gisu, not against a growworm. Doyon didn't sleep for 2 nights after that conversation. He was thinking. Growworm. The size of a house. Armor. Steel won't penetrate it. If it comes out to the lake and enters the water, Terran couldn't swim. The growworm probably can't swim either. But if the water isn't deep enough near the shore, it could just walk along the bottom. 4 meters deep. If the creature is the size of a house, then 4 meters is chest deep for it. It won't drown. Doyon stared at the dark lake and calculated. We need depth. We need to move the city farther from the shore, to a depth of 6 or 7 meters at least. But the anchors? At that depth, we'll need long anchor ropes and heavier weights. And if the wind is strong, the city will start drifting. A problem. A classic engineering problem. Deep-water anchoring of a platform with a minimum of materials. He'd solved something like this in his 3rd year of college, only back then there was a computer and databases, and here, a stick and a rope made of reeds. The solution came on the 2nd night. Not a weight anchor, a pile anchor. Drive wooden piles into the lake bottom, tie the tops of the piles to the platforms. A pile doesn't drift. A pile stands firm. The city will stand on its own 2 feet instead of dangling from a rope. For this, he needs long logs, about 8 meters, straight, strong. You need a sledgehammer to drive them in, or better yet,
a pile driver. The simplest kind of pile driver, a tripod made of logs, a suspended weight that you lift and drop onto the pile. 30 blows and the pile goes 2 meters into the bottom. That's enough. Doyon explained the plan to Chansu and Tegil. Chansu nodded. Tegil asked why. Doyon explained about the crockworm. Tegil fell silent. Then he said that Doyon thinks like a commander. Doyon said he thinks like an engineer. Tegil replied that in this world, there's no difference. They began chopping down the trunks the next morning. The work took a week, 12 piles, each 8 meters long. Heavy. 6 of them carried them. Doyon gathered the wood in a day. A tripod, a block of smooth stone, a rope through the block, 100-kilogram load, stones in a net. It took 3 hours to drive in the first pile, 2 hours for the second, 40 minutes for the fifth. Practice. By the end of the week, the city stood on 12 piles 6 meters deep, 80 meters from the shore. Crockworm won't make it. Even if it enters the water, it'll be up to its head, and Gisu can't swim. Doyon hoped they couldn't. The system updated. Level 2. Doyon stood on the platform and read the text before his eyes. Marine construction, Level 2. New materials. Planed boards. Standard length, 3 meters. Width, 30 centimeters. Sealing resin, 5 liters. Bronze nails, 100 pieces. He blinked. Boards. Real planed boards. Not logs. Boards. And resin. And nails. That changed everything. With boards, you could build decks, not rafts. With sealing, you could make watertight compartments. With nails, you could forget about the reed ropes that rot every 3 weeks. He crouched down and clasped his head in his hands. Not from pain, from the flood of ideas that came all at once. A deck, walls, a roof, real houses, on the water. He could build real houses. Chance walked over and asked if everything was okay. Doyon looked up, smiled, said it was more than okay. Tomorrow, they would start building, for real. The end of the second month. 64 people, 14 platforms. The first platform of the new type, a wooden deck, even, smooth, not a single crack. People walked across it and couldn't believe it. They were used to logs under their feet, to cracks through which they could see the water, to the constant feeling that the structure was about to fall apart. The plank deck was like a stone floor, only on the water. Old woman Pa Usan stepped onto it and stamped her foot. Hard. She smiled and said, "You could dance here." Someone laughed, then someone else, and a minute later, everyone was laughing. Doyon stood to the side and smiled too. The platform held. The deck didn't creak. The piles stood straight. The structure worked. He's an engineer. The structure works. That's the best thing an engineer can say. Third month. Population 78. 20 platforms. Doyon had stopped counting the platforms one by one. Now he counted them in rings. The first ring, residential. 12 platforms connected in a closed loop. In the center, open water for fishing and water intake. Second ring, outer ring. 8 platforms. Farms, workshop, Minji Hospital, warehouse. Between the rings, bridges and walkways. 4 of them. North, south, east, west. The city was small, ridiculous by the standards of any real city. But it was a city, with streets made of bridges, with a square in the center, with neighborhoods, and with people who woke up every morning and went to work, some to the farm, some to the traps, some to cut reeds, some to weave ropes. No one sat idle. Doyon didn't make them. It was just that everyone had a task, and everyone why. Grace Holloway arrived at the beginning of the 3rd month. Doyon remembered that day because she was the first person who looked at his structures and said that the knot on the 6th pile was tied incorrectly. She was right. Doyon retied the knot that very evening. Grace didn't come alone. There were 8 other people with her, all from the far western coast. Another continent, another language, different faces. Grace was tall, broad-shouldered. Her hands were calloused, thicker than Doyon's. Her reddish hair was cut short. Her face was weather-beaten. She spoke the local language with a heavy accent, worse than Doyon's. But her grammar was correct. She had studied the language long and thoroughly, like everything she did. Grace said she was a master carpenter. She had built ships at the Ran-Tira shipyards. That was the name of a city on that continent, a city that no longer existed. The Gisu had come there too. She said it calmly, like a fact, without emotion. Doyon realized she had burned all emotion out of herself long ago. What remained were her hands, and her head, and the habit of looking at a tree and seeing a structure in it. Doyon showed her the city, everything, every platform, every node, every pile, the pile driver, the filters, the trusses, the hospital. Grace walked in silence. She touched the joints. She bent down and looked up at the framework from below. She tapped the planks with her knuckles. She checked the tension of the ropes. Then she stopped. She looked at Doya. She said the structure was held together by snot and prayers. But the idea was sound. Doyon nodded. He knew. Grace said that if he gave her tools and people, she'd rebuild everything in a month so it would last 5 years. Doyon said the tools were shoddy. Grace said she'd worked with worse. She wasn't bragging. She was stating a fact. Doyon held out his hand. She shook it. Her grip was like a vice. With Grace's arrival, the construction site changed. She didn't just build. She taught how to build. Every knot, every joint, the right angle, the right gap, the right grain direction. Things that Doyon knew in theory, Grace knew with her hands. She could tell by touch whether a log was dry. She could tell by the sound of a tap whether there was a crack inside. She could look at a board and say how much it would bend under load. Doyon designed. Grace brought it to life. They worked side by side and hardly spoke. There was no need. He drew with a stick on a wet board. She watched and nodded, or shook her head and showed why it wouldn't. He changed the drawing. She nodded. It was the best workflow of his life, including both lives. In the 2nd week of the 3rd month, a boat arrived. A real boat, with a sail. From Sonnen, there were 2 people in the boat. A man in clean clothes with a belt from which a seal hung, and a woman in light armor with a sword on her back. An envoy and a guard. The envoy introduced himself. Mo-In-Su, an envoy from the Hunters' Council of Sonon Fortress. He spoke politely. Too politely. In that polite tone that in Korea means they consider you 3 ranks below them. Doyon knew that tone well. Corporate negotiations had taught him. Mo-In-Su said that the council had heard about the settlement on the lake. The council is surprised. The council expresses respect for the residents' hard work. The council would also like to clarify. Who authorized the construction? On whose land does the settlement stand? What is the residents' status? Do they pay taxes? Doyon listened. He nodded. Then he asked one thing. How many refugees had Sonyang accepted over the past month? Mo-In-Su hesitated. He said that the council reviews each application individually. Doyon repeated the question. How many? Mo-In-Su said 12. Doyon said that over the same month,
300 people had come here. All accepted, all alive, all fed. Mo Insu looked at the city, at the platforms, at the people working, at the children running across the bridges, at the farms with greenery. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he would pass it on to the council. He got into a boat and sailed away. The guard remained. She said she had no orders to return, only orders to escort the envoy. The envoy had sailed away. Her orders were fulfilled. Her name was Yuna Park. Tall, a scar across her left eyebrow. She moved in such a way that Doyon couldn't help but follow her with his eyes. Like water, smoothly and inexorably. Taegil looked at her and recognized her. Park Yuna, from the Falcon Blade clan, the best fighter of the younger generation of Sonon. Exiled. Yuna looked at Taegil, said she was a former member, from a former clan. Taegil nodded. There were many former members in this world. Yuna didn't ask for permission to stay, just like Minji. She just stayed. On the second day, she took one of the workboats and sailed away at dawn. She returned by lunchtime with 3 fish, each the size of a hand. She tossed them onto the deck and said the fish were bigger in the southern part of the lake. Doyon asked how she knew. Yuna said she'd looked at the current. Food flows with the current. Fish follow the food. The current flows south, so the fish are in the south. Doyon looked at her with respect. She thought like an engineer, only about living systems. On the third day, he showed her the underwater nets. He explained the idea. Not fishing nets, defensive ones. A net with spikes made of sharpened sticks, stretched underwater around the city's perimeter. If a creature enters the water and swims, it will run into it. It won't kill it, but it will slow it down. It will buy time. Yuna listened. Then she said the idea was good, but the wooden spikes were too soft. We need metal, or bone. Doyon nodded. There wasn't much metal. Bone. Terran bone. They returned to the shallows, where a Terran had drowned 3 months earlier. The carcass had already decomposed, but the bones remained. Large, strong, black as stone. Yuna carved 20 spikes from the Terran's ribs, each as long as a forearm, sharp as knives. Doyon wove them into the net. The first line of defense was ready. By the end of the 3rd month, the city looked different. 20 platforms, 2 rings, 4 bridges, an underwater net with bone spikes along the perimeter, a pile foundation 6 meters deep, plank decks on the living platforms, reed canopies with clay plaster on the framework, almost walls, almost roofs, almost houses. Grace worked non-stop. She had brought 2 men from that continent with her and trained 4 more locals. A crew. 6 people. They built and repaired while Doyon designed the next module. Minji expanded the hospital, the 3rd section, for women in labor, because Im Hayon was pregnant, her 2nd child. She had gotten pregnant already here, on the water. When Doyon found out, he stood there for a minute and couldn't say a word. Then he went and built a separate platform for her, a small one, with railings, with a canopy to shade her from the sun, with a ladder so Dalsu could climb up on his own. Hayon looked at it all and said the railing was too high. Doyon said that with a baby it would be just right. Hayon looked at him. Then she said he was thinking ahead. Doyon replied that it was his job. The town was growing, 80 people. Doyon felt the balance shifting. This was no longer a refugee camp. It was a settlement. People had developed routines, morning rounds of the farms, fishing in the afternoon, an evening bonfire in the central square. The children went into the water to swim, and Minji scolded them, saying they'd catch a cold. Chung-Soo began carving small figures out of bone and gave them to the children. San-hyun wove his first rug, a real rug made of reeds. He laid it on deck of his platform and said that now he had a home. Tae-gil stood in the watchtower and looked toward the shore, every morning, every evening. He didn't smile, but he no longer looked like a man waiting for death. Yuna began training the volunteers, 5 young men and 2 women, not hunters, a militia. She taught them to shoot a bow, not at targets, at pumpkins floating on the water, moving targets, practical. Do-yeon watched and thought that this city was already alive, not just surviving, living. On the last day of the 3rd month, Emily Reed arrived. She came alone, with a backpack and a notebook under her arm. Petite, red-headed, freckles covering every inch of her face. She spoke quickly and with such an accent that even Grace winced. She introduced herself as a cartographer. She said she had come from the Tonbret colony on the southwestern coast. The colony had fallen 2 years ago.
Since then, she had been walking east and drawing maps. Maps she erased, because every city she marked on the map ceased to exist a month or 2 later. She said this with a smile, but the smile was like a crack in glass. Do-yeon realized she was on the brink, on the very edge of something from which there is no return. He asked if she could draw a map of his city. Emily looked at the platforms, at the rings, at the bridges, at the farms. Then she opened her notebook, a blank page, and she began to draw, quickly, confidently, line by line. An hour later she had a map, 1 to 200 scale, accurate, beautiful, with depth markers and current directions. Do-yeon looked at the map and couldn't take his eyes off it. For the first time, he saw his city from the outside, as a whole, not as a collection of platforms he'd been gathering one by one, but as a city, with form, with logic, with a beauty he hadn't planned but which had emerged on its own. Emily finished and handed him the sheet. She said it was the first map in her life that wouldn't have to be erased, and she fell silent. Her hands were trembling. Do-yeon took the map. He looked at it, then at Emily. He said they'd need a bigger map, a scale of 1 to 100, with room for new rings, because the city would grow. Emily looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but her mouth was already smiling. Not a crack, a real smile. She said that in that case, she'd need bigger paper. Do-yeon said they would make the paper, too. The 4th month began with rain. Not just any rain. A wall of water came from the west for 3 days straight. The platforms swayed. The awnings leaked. People sat there, wet and angry. The children were crying. Old woman Park Uson said it was a sign, that the water didn't want them to live there. Do-yeon said nothing. He stood in the rain at the edge of the platform and counted. Streams of rainwater ran down the awnings and into the lake. Fresh water, clean, better than the lake water. And he was letting it go to waste. It was foolish. The next morning he stretched a canvas over the central square. The canvas was made of reeds and resin, rough but waterproof. The water ran down the slope into a bark trough. The trough led to a barrel made of planks nailed together. In a single rainy day, the barrel filled up. 40 liters of the purest rainwater. No filtration, No boiling. Drink.
Minji tasted it. She nodded.
Do-yeon set up a second barrel, a third. By the end of the rains, they had 120 liters in reserve. Old woman Park Uson looked at the barrels and said that the water wanted them to live on it. You just have to know how to ask. Do-yeon didn't argue. After the rains came the sun, both of them, and the heat.
The two suns beat down so fiercely that the deck planks burned their feet. People hid under the awnings. Work slowed down. Doyon thought, heat is a problem, but heat is also a resource. He remembered how they collected condensation at the marine farms in Busan. At night, the temperature drops. Moisture from the air settles on cold surfaces. In the morning, you collect it. He hung 5 canvas awnings over the water on low poles. At dawn, as the awnings cooled, droplets formed on them. Dozens of drops. Hundreds. They ran down the slope toward the center of the awning and dripped into the shards held out below. 1/2 liter from each awning. 2.5 liters every morning. For free. Straight from the air. Emily stood nearby and took notes. She wrote down everything Doyon did. Every design, every decision, every detail. She said that if anything, the knowledge must not be lost. Doyon looked at her. He thought she was right. That knowledge was the most valuable thing he had. More valuable than the platforms. More valuable than the system. He sat down next to her and began to dictate. How to build a pile foundation. How to weave a basket. How to filter water. How to collect condensate. Emily wrote, quickly, in small handwriting. She filled 12 pages in a single evening. Doyon said this was only the beginning. Emily said there was enough paper. The population was growing. 92 people by the middle of the 4th month. New faces every week. Doyon noticed a pattern. The first ones came in families, small groups, frightened, silent. Now, large groups were coming, 10 to 15 people at a time, organized, with belongings, with tools, with a plan. They weren't coming because they were fleeing. They were coming because they had heard and chosen. That was the difference, a huge difference. Among the newcomers was a group of 16 people from the settlement of Kanjin. Kanjin was still standing. It hadn't fallen, but the people had left, voluntarily, because life on the water was better. When Doyon learned this, he sat down on the deck and was silent for a long time. People were leaving an entire fortress to live on his platforms. That meant something. That's something big. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. Among those who had come from Kanjin was a girl, Ha Aeon, 17 years old. She talked non-stop. She asked questions with every breath. What is this? How does it work? Why this way and not another? Why is there resin here? Why 3 anchors and not 2? Why is the farm on the south side and not the north? Doyon answered, to every question, patiently, because the questions were valid, not silly, not idle, precise. Aeon looked at the world the way engineers do. She didn't know that word yet, but she was already one of them. On the 3rd day, she came to him with a piece of bark on which she had scribbled a sketch. A small platform, 2 by 2 meters, with shelves on the sides. She said she wanted to build a library. Doyon looked at the sketch. The scale was off. The shelves were too thin. The base was unstable. He picked up a stick and began making corrections. He showed her where to reinforce it, where to remove the excess, where to add a crossbar. Aeon watched. She nodded. Her eyes were shining. She asked if she could build it herself. Doyon said she could, but with his supervision at every stage. Aeon ran off to Grace to ask for tools. Grace watched her go and said that either this girl would build a city or tear it down. The 5th month. Doyon faced the problem he had been expecting from day 1. People. Not monsters, not the elements. People. Among those who had come from Kanjin was a man named Hong Dae-jun, about 50 years old, a former village head, used to giving orders, accustomed to being listened to. He came to the water and saw that a 29-year-old guy with a foreign accent was calling the shots here. Taejun didn't start a riot. He acted smarter, quietly, through conversations.
He approached people in the evening by the campfire and spoke. That the platforms were cramped, that there wasn't enough food, that there were no clothes, that winter was coming and no one knew if the city would survive the cold. All of this was true. Doyon knew it better than anyone. But Taejun said it in a way that made the truth sound like an accusation. Here, he implied, are the problems. And here is a man who can't solve them. Taegil came to Doyon and said that Taejun was stirring things up. He suggested they have a man-to-man talk. Doyon refused. He said that if a man speaks the truth, you can't beat him for telling the truth. You can only respond with action. Doyon responded with action. In 2 weeks, he built what he called a winter module, a platform with walls made of resin-coated planks, a 3-layer thatched roof, insulation, moss between the planks. Inside, a clay stove, a small one, for 2 logs. A chimney made of clay pipes led out through the roof. He lit the stove to test it. It got warm inside the module, really warm, just like in a house. Doyon invited Taejun to take a look. Taejun stepped inside. He stood there. He touched the walls. He looked at the stove. He went out. He didn't say anything, but that evening by the fire, he was silent, and the next evening too. Grace said that one winter module was just a demonstration. They needed 20 to get through the winter. Doyon said there would be 30. Grace raised an eyebrow. She said that in that case she would need more people. Doyon gave her 10, the best ones. Grace began building. In the middle of the 5th month, Yuna came to Doyon with news. Bad news. She had returned from a reconnaissance mission on the southern shore. There was a camp there. Not refugees. Black flags. Tents in a row. Campfires. People with weapons. About 30 people, maybe 40. Yuna got close. She heard their conversations. They called themselves the Black Banners. A cult. They believed that the Gisu was a punishment from the gods, that people deserved it, and that anyone who tried to save themselves was committing blasphemy, especially a city on the water. Because water is a sacred element, and building on it is an insult. Yuna said they were preparing an attack. Doyon listened. His hands didn't tremble. His mind was working. 30 to 40 people with weapons. On land. They won't reach the city by water. The city stands 80 meters from the shore. They can shoot with bows, but the distance is too great. They might try to row over in boats, if they have boats. They might set it on fire, if they make it. Doyon asked Yuna if she'd seen any boats at the camp. Yuna said no, but she'd seen axes. They could cut down trees and build a raft in a day, maybe 2. Doyon nodded. A second line of defense was needed, an outer one. He had been working for 3 days with almost no sleep. Grace was working alongside him. Yuna was coordinating the volunteers. The result? A belt of floating barriers around the city. 30 meters from the outer ring, logs tied together with sharpened stakes sticking up and out to the sides. If a raft or boat approaches, it will run aground. There are gaps between the barriers, 4 of them, passages, but they were closed off. Thick chains made of rope and reed cord. Pull the rope and the passage is blocked. Simple, quick, effective. Yuna positioned archers on the outer ring, 5 of them. Not hunters, militiamen. But Yuna had trained them for 2 months. They could hit a gourd from 30 meters away. That was enough. The Black Banners arrived at dawn on the 6th day after Yuna discovered the camp. Doyon was standing in the watchtower and saw them, about 35 men, with torches, with weapons, with black flags. They came ashore and stopped. They looked at the city, at the 80 meters of water between them, at the barricades with stakes, at the archers on the towers. Their leader stepped forward. Tall, thin, his face covered with black cloth. He was shouting.
Doyon heard the words, that they were blasphemers, that the water was sacred, that the city must be burned, that the inhabitants must come ashore and accept their punishment. Doyon remained silent. Yuna stood nearby with a crossbow. Tegu was on the second tower with a sword. Grace stood below, holding a harpoon. The leader shouted for a long time. Then he fell silent. He looked at the water, at the barriers, at the archers. His men stood behind him, shifting from foot to foot. They had come to burn, not to fight a fortified city on the water. The leader turned and left. His men followed him. An hour later, the shore was empty. Yuna lowered her crossbow. Her hands were completely still. Doyon asked if they would return. Yuna said yes, with the boats. Doyon nodded. So a third line was needed. The third line was Doyon's idea, one he'd been mulling over since the first week. Floating traps. He'd spent 3 days building them. The design was simple, a wooden platform 1 meter by 1 meter. On it, a piece of rotten meat, bait. Underneath the platform was a cage made of stakes, open at the bottom. When something heavy climbed onto the platform, the stakes gave way. A latch. It closed. The creature was inside. The creature was in the water. The creature can't swim. But the traps were for monsters. For people, he made something else. False platforms, small rafts that looked like part of the city but were empty, with a rope tied to the barrier. If someone rows up in a boat and tries to land on a false platform, it will tip over. A person in the water in armor or with a weapon would sink, or flounder, or grab onto the barrier with spikes. The result was the same. Doan didn't want to kill people, but he wanted an attack on his city to be impossible. Not dangerous. Impossible. Those are different things. The 5th month was coming to an end. 102 people, 24 platforms, 2 rings and an outer defensive belt. 6 winter modules are ready, 14 more in the works. The farms yielded greens every day. Fish were caught consistently. Filters and barrels provided water. The Minji hospital was operational. A school. No, not a school. But Emily was teaching 3 children to read and write, on slates, with charcoal. And Doyon taught Aeon to calculate loads, an hour every evening. She solved the problems he came up with. What kind of log can hold 100 kilograms? How many piles are needed for a 20 square meter platform? What angle of the awning provides maximum water collection? Aeon made mistakes, often, but less and less every day. Doyon sat on the pier in the evening and watched the sunset. Minji approached and sat down next to him, silently. It wasn't the first time they'd sat like this, silently, side by side, feet dangling over the water. She didn't ask where he was from, didn't ask about the system, didn't ask why he knew what he knew. She just sat next to him, and that was enough. That evening she said one thing, that tomorrow was Dalsu's birthday. He was turning 4. Hyon wanted to bake him a flatbread, but there was no flour. Doyon thought. He looked at the farm. The bossam had grown. Lots of green, juicy. Not flour, but if you dry the leaves and grind them in a mortar, you'll get a powder. Not flour, but it's similar. If you mix it with fish and bake it in a clay dish on the stove, you'll get a pie. A fish pie with greens. Not a flatbread. But for a 4-year-old boy on a floating city in a world full of monsters, it would be the best pie in the world. Doyon said there would be flour. Minji looked at him. He looked at her. The sunset turned the water orange. Both suns were setting. He thought that this was the first time he was building something not for survival, but for joy, for a little boy who would turn a year older tomorrow, in the city on the water, which was built by a man who died on the bridge in Busan. The world was strange, but on this evening, it was right. In the morning, Doyeon baked a pie. It was lopsided, burnt on one edge, green from the posam. The fish inside had fallen apart, and the taste was strange. Dalsu took a bite, chewed, smiled, said it was delicious. Haeyeon was crying. Park Woo-son was crying. Even Taegil turned away. Yoona stood to the side and watched it all with the expression of someone who doesn't understand why people cry over food. But then Dalsu ran up to her and held out a piece of pie. Small, green, crumpled. Yoona looked at him, looked at the piece, took it, took a bite, nodded. She said it was delicious. Dalsu laughed and ran to the next person. Yoona stood with a piece of pie in her hand and didn't move. Minji saw it. Doyeon saw it. No one said a word. Some things don't need to be said out loud. By the end of the 5th month, the system displayed a new message. Progress to level 3, 32%, 102 people. Each had lived on the platforms for an average of 40 days. Thousands of person days. The system counted. Doyeon built. The city lived. And every evening an engineer sat on the pier and watched the sunset. He thought about tomorrow, about winter, about the black banners, about Sunon, about what lay at the bottom of the lake, about his people, about each of the 102. He knew everyone by name. He knew who slept where. He knew who had a sore knee and who had a toothache. He knew who was afraid of water and who was afraid of the dark. He wasn't building a city. He was building a home for specific people. And that made him stronger than any hunter with a sword, because a hunter defends walls, and an engineer defends people. The 6th month. Winter was creeping in slowly. The sun set earlier, rose later. The wind from the north carried a cold that made lips crack. The water in the lake darkened. It grew thick, almost black. The fish had gone deep, and the traps came back empty for 2 days in a row. Doan knew this would happen. He was prepared. 30 winter modules. Grace had finished the 28th. The 29th was on the slipway. The 30th was in the blueprints. Each module held 4. Walls of planks, moss in the cracks, a clay stove, a chimney, a roof of 3 layers of reed coated with resin, dry and warm inside, wind and darkness outside. People moved from the shelters into the modules and couldn't believe it. Walls, a roof, a door that closes. For people who had slept under the open sky for the past year, it was like a palace. The old man, who never gave his name, went into his module. He stood there. He touched the wall. Then he sat down on the floor and didn't get up until morning. Minji said he was fine. He had simply remembered what a home was. Population, 126. Newcomers arrived even in winter. Less often, but they came. Exhausted, frostbitten, hungry. Minji greeted each one, examined them, treated them, fed them. Then she handed them over to Doyeon, who decided where to settle them. He knew every module, knew where there was room. He knew who would get along with whom. This old man next to Park Woo-son. She loves to talk, and he's a man of few words. A perfect match. This young family next to Haeyeon. Haeyeon knows what it's like with a small child. She'll help. This sullen man far away from everyone else. He needs time. First, he'll thaw out. Then we'll settle him in. Grace once said that Doyeon arranges people like furniture in a room. taking into account who stands where and who gets in whose way. Doyon said they aren't furniture. They're loads. Emotional loads are distributed just like physical ones. If you overload one corner, the whole structure will collapse. Sunhwa arrived at the beginning of winter. Not alone, with a group of 7 people, 4 adults and 3 children. They were coming from the northeast, from an agricultural region that had fed 3 fortresses. The region had fallen. The fields were burned. Not by the Gisu, by their own people. The village head had ordered them burned so the vermin wouldn't get them. A scorched earth tactic. Doyon had heard this many times before. Sunhwa was small, a head shorter than Doyon. Skinny, her hands were buried in the dirt up to her elbows, even though there was no soil around her. She was carrying a sack and clutching it to her chest like a baby. The sack contained seeds, 10 varieties, maybe more. Grains, root vegetables, legumes, herbs. She had been collecting them for 3 years, from every field she passed through. A handful from here, a handful from there. The sack weighed about 5 kilograms and was the most valuable thing on the platform within a 100-meter radius. Doyon realized this immediately. He walked up to Sunhwa and asked what she could do. Sunhwa looked up at him. She said she could grow things. Anything. Anywhere. Give her soil and water and she'll feed everyone. Doyon said there was no soil. There was water. Sunhwa looked at the farms, at the floating beds with bok choy and radishes. She crouched down. She touched the moss. She sniffed the water. She pulled a radish root out of the substrate. She examined it. She said the substrate was poor. The moss provided few nutrients. Fish meal was needed, ground bones, ash from the furnaces. Mix it with the moss. Then the harvest will triple. Doyon watched her and felt what an engineer feels when they're brought the missing component. Relief. Pure relief. He gave her all the farms, all 6, and said he'd build more, as many as she said. Sonka nodded. She took the sack off her shoulder, untied it, took out the first bundle of seeds, and went to work. A week later, the farms had changed. Sunhwa had reworked the substrate, moss plus fish meal plus ash, a dark, rich mass that smelled like a swamp but worked like black soil. The radishes grew twice as large, the basas became greener and juicier, and most importantly, Sunhwa planted beans. Beans are protein, real protein, plant-based. Fish plus beans is a complete meal. Not luxurious, but sufficient. Minji said that a month after eating beans, people's gums would stop bleeding. Doyon didn't know that people's gums bled. Minji said that half the city. A lack of nutrients. Scurvy. Doyon felt a chill run down his spine. He was building walls and decks, and people were getting sick right under his feet. He went to Sunhwa and asked what else was needed. Sunhwa listed it. More farms, more substrate, more fish meal, and greenhouses. Enclosed greenhouses for the winter. Without them, half the crops would die from the frost. Doyon built a greenhouse in 3 days. A frame of planks, walls of reed mats coated with resin, a transparent roof. No, not transparent. He didn't have glass for the roof. But he had fish bladders. The large fish caught in the southern part of the lake had swim bladders the size of a palm. If carefully dried and stretched, they formed a film, translucent, letting light through. Not glass, but it was enough for a greenhouse. Sonka looked at the greenhouse and said nothing. She simply went inside and began planting. Winter nights were long, 15 hours of darkness. Doyon stayed awake for 6 of them. He lay in his module and listened. The wind, the creaking of planks, the lapping of water, a distant howl from the shore.
Gisu. They were more active in winter, hungrier. Tegel said that in winter the Tedans gathered in packs. In summer they were loners. In winter, 5 or 6, looking for warmth, looking for food. Toyon thought about this every night. A pack of 6 Tedans. If they come out to the lake, 1 doesn't swim. 6. 6 don't swim either, but 6 is a different level of noise, a different level of panic. The children will start screaming. The adults will start running. Someone will fall into the water. We need an alert system. We need a protocol. He came up with it in a single night. 3 signals. 1 strike of the bell. Attention. Danger on the shore. Stay where you are. 2 strikes. Alarm. Everyone to the modules. Close the doors. 3 strikes. Evacuation. Untie the city from the piles and tow it to the middle of the lake. A bell. He didn't have a bell, but he had bronze. Bronze nails. The system provided them on the 2nd level. Doyle melted down 30 nails in a clay crucible on the stove. He got an ingot, a small one, but Grace cast a bell from it, the size of a fist. The sound was high-pitched and clear, audible on all platforms. Doyle hung it on the central mast. He explained the signals, to everyone, personally. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3. They remembered. A week later he held a drill. 2 strikes. People rushed into the modules. The doors closed. Silence. 2 minutes from the signal to full readiness. Too long. It needs to be faster. He ran it again. 1 minute 40. One more time. 1 minute 20. Tegel said that in Sonnen, the garrison responds in 3 minutes. Doyon said his city isn't a garrison. His city is faster. The pack arrived in the 4th week of winter, at night. Doyon woke up to a screeching sound. He went out on deck. Dark. The moon was behind the clouds. A north wind, cold to the bone. Eyes glowed on the shore. Small, yellow, about 20 of them. Not Terrans. Smaller, quicker, moving fast, like rats. Tegel jumped up to the lookout. He looked. He cursed. He said 1 word. Chwigis. Little Gisu, the size of a dog, weak on their own, but in packs of 20 or 30, they could wipe out a village in an hour. Fast. Toothy. And here's the bad part. They could swim. Doyon felt something snap inside him. They swim. They swim. Everything he'd built was based on the fact that Gisu don't swim. Underwater nets, barriers, deep water deployment. All of that is useless if the creature swims. He struck the bell, twice. The city came to life. Doors slammed shut. Silence. 10 minutes. Archers on the towers. Yuna on the outer ring with a crossbow. The Chvigis entered the water. They swam fast. Their small bodies glided across the surface like water beetles. 20 of them. Maybe 25. They were heading for the barrier. The first Chvigis ran into the stakes. It squealed. It recoiled. The second one went around the barrier from the side. The third one climbed over the top. Yuna fired. The bolt pierced the creature right through. The Chvigis twitched and went underwater. The archers opened fire. Arrows in the darkness. Half missed, but half hit. 5 creatures fell. The rest swam on. Doan stood on the deck and thought. Fast. Very fast. They'll get past the barriers. In a minute they'll be at the outer ring. Underwater nets with bone spikes. The Chvigis are small. The spikes are spaced for Terrans. A small creature will slip through them. Think. Think. Water. Cold water. Winter water. 5 degrees. Small Chvigis. Low body mass. They cool down faster. Cold-blooded like all Gisu. Thagil talked about this. They're slower in winter. If we make them stay in the water longer, hold them back, don't kill them, Hold them back. They'll get cold, slow down, and drown on their own. Doyon shouted, Yuna, barriers! Close all the passages, all 4. Don't let them in or out. Yuna understood instantly. She shouted the order.
The volunteers pulled the ropes, the passages and the barriers closed. The Chwigis were trapped between 2 lines. Barriers on the outside, underwater nets on the inside. They thrashed about, looking for a way through, finding none, swimming in circles. 5 minutes, 10. Their movements slowed. The water was taking away their heat. Their small bodies were growing cold. At the 15-minute mark, the first Chwigis stopped moving and went under the water. At the 20-minute mark, 3 more. At the 30-minute mark, 6 more. By dawn, not a single one remained on the surface. They had all drowned. 23 corpses on the bottom, between the barriers and the underwater nets. The city lost 0 people, 0 wounded, 0 damage. Doyon sat on the deck and trembled, not from the cold, from the realization of how close it had been. If he hadn't remembered to stay calm, if Yuna hadn't closed the passages in 10 seconds, if the wind had blown from the south and the water had been 2 degrees warmer, he clenched his hands into fists and told himself one thing. We need a 3rd line for the small creatures, a fine net, a fine meshed one, all around the perimeter. Tomorrow. Minji found him at dawn. He was sitting on the pier, staring at the water where dead Chwigis were floating. She sat down beside him, silently. Then she said he hadn't slept. Doyon said he couldn't. Minji said he had to sleep, that the city wouldn't fall apart in a single night. Doyon looked at her. He said the city wouldn't fall apart, but he might. Minji was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that he was carrying as much as a person could bear. Doyon recognized his own words, the ones he'd said to her in the first month, about the burden, about the collapse. She'd returned them to him, exactly, just in time. He closed his eyes, exhaled. Minji placed her hand on his shoulder, light, like a feather. He didn't open his eyes. He just sat there, with her hand on his shoulder, with dead creatures in the water, with the city behind him, with 126 people sleeping in the warmth, because he wasn't sleeping. Midwinter, the 7th month, the darkest time. 2 suns barely rose above the horizon. 6 hours of daylight. Then darkness. Long, icy darkness. The lake was covered with a thin crust of ice near the shores. Not in the center. In the center, the depth kept it from freezing. But near the shores, the ice stood firm. And that was a problem. Ice is a bridge for the Gisu. A creature that doesn't swim can walk across the ice, Doyon calculated. The ice was 4 centimeters thick near the shore. It would hold the Chwigis. It wouldn't hold a Terran. A Terran would fall through, but a Chwigis would make it across. And further out, the ice was thinner, 1 centimeter, then open water. The Chwigis would fall through halfway. Or they wouldn't. If the night was cold enough and the ice thickened. Doyon couldn't rely on the weather. He took a boat out to the edge of the ice crust and began breaking it, with a pickaxe, methodically. A strip of open water 3 meters wide, all the way around, every morning. 2 hours of work, hands in icy water. Chansu helped. Then 4 more joined in. Every morning, 6 men went out in boats and broke the ice. It became a ritual, morning ice breaking.
The children watched from the platforms and counted the blows. 214, 215, 216. Chansu once said he felt like an idiot. Doyan said an idiot is someone who waits for the ice to get thick. Chansu snorted and struck the ice with the pick even harder. Hong Taejong began speaking again. Winter had made everything worse. The cold, the cramped quarters, the darkness. People sat in the modules in groups of 4 and couldn't go out for hours. They argued over trifles, over a spot by the stove, over snoring, over smells. Taejong walked between the modules and listened. He collected complaints. Then he went out into the square and spoke, loudly, in front of everyone, that winter was only halfway through, that supplies wouldn't last, that the firewood was running out, that people were freezing, that the city was a trap, that on land, at least, they could build a bigger fire. Doyan listened. Taejon was right on every point. Winter was harsh, supplies were dwindling, the firewood was indeed running out. There were no trees on the platforms. Every log had to be brought in from the shore, and the shore was dangerous in winter. Terans roamed in packs. Chuigis prowled at night. Every trip for firewood was a risk to one's life. Doyan thought, for 3 nights. Then he gathered everyone in the square. He stood before 130 people. Frozen. Angry. Exhausted. And he said that firewood was no longer needed. Silence. Taejun smirked. He asked what they would use to heat the stoves. Dreams. Doyon said one word. Peat. The people didn't understand. Peat. The bottom of the lake in shallow water is covered with a layer of organic matter, decayed algae, silt, dead plants. All of this is compressed into a dense, dark mass. Peat. If you dig it up from the bottom, dry it, and press it into briquettes, it burns. Slowly. For a long time. It burns hotter than wood. And there's enough of it at the bottom of the lake to last 10 winters. Doyon knew this because he had designed offshore farms in Korea. The bottom silt was the enemy. It clogged filters. It ruined equipment. But if you look at it as fuel, the enemy becomes a resource. He dived into the icy water that very day. He scooped up a bucket of bottom sediment. Black, greasy, stinky. He spread it out on a board, pressed it with his hands into flat cakes, dried them by the stove for 3 days. Then he put a dry cake into the stove. It caught fire. Slowly, with a hiss. But it burned, and it gave off heat. Good heat. Taejun stood nearby and watched. He said nothing. He left. He never spoke of firewood again. Grace organized the peat harvest in 2 days. 10 people with buckets on ropes scooped mud from the bottom. They dried it on racks, pressed it, stacked it. By the end of the week, the supply of peat briquettes took up an entire platform, enough for a month. 2 if we conserve. The 8th month. A storm. Doyon had been waiting for it since the first day of winter. Every day he looked at the sky and counted the clouds, the wind direction, pressure. He determined the pressure by the water's behavior. When the pressure drops, the lake's surface becomes restless even without wind. A slight ripple, bubbles near the shore. The fish go deeper. He noticed this in the 3rd week and had been checking every morning since then. On the morning of the 23rd day of the 8th month, the water was as still as glass. No ripples, no bubbles. The fish had vanished completely. Doyon ran to Taegil. He asked if winter storms ever occurred here. Taegil turned pale. He said one word. Chungpung, a heavenly whirlwind. It happens once every 3 to 5 years. It rips the roofs off stone fortresses. It snaps trees like matchsticks. The walls of Songyeon withstood the last Chungpung only because they were reinforced with Hunter's magic. Toyon asked when. Taegil looked up at the sky. He said by nightfall. Toyon had 8 hours. 8 hours to prepare the floating city of wood and reeds for the storm that breaks stone walls. He didn't panic. Panic is a luxury. He had a task, and he had been solving problems his whole life. A wave. A storm is a wave. A high wave. A stone fortress stands and resists. The wave crashes into the wall. The wall either holds or it doesn't. But a floating structure shouldn't resist. It should move with the wave, not against it. With it. The principle of damping. Toyon recalled the floating breakwaters he had designed in Busan. A structure that dampens the wave not with rigidity, but with flexibility. It rises with the wave and falls with the wave. The energy dissipates. There is no impact. He gathered everyone. Explained. Briefly. A storm. By nightfall. A strong one. The city will hold out if we do 3 things. First, loosen all rigid connections between the platforms. Don't untie them. Loosen them. Allow some play, so that each platform can move relative to its neighbor. Otherwise, the wave will snap the rigid structure like a stick. Second, remove all tall structures, masts, towers, canopies that catch the wind, anything sticking up more than a meter. The wind is a sail. The city must have no sails. Third, tie everything down. People, things, supplies. Every person is tied with a rope to the nearest pile. If a wave sweeps them off the deck, the rope will hold them. People listened. Their faces were gray, frightened. Pak Usan whispered a prayer. Children huddled close to their mothers. Taejun stood in the back rows and said nothing. Doyeon saw that people were afraid. He said one more thing, that a city on water cannot sink. Wood doesn't sink. The platforms won't sink. They might capsize. They might drift apart. They might lose their deck and canopy, but they won't sink, and the people are tied down, so the people won't sink either. It was a simplification, a crude one, but that was exactly what people needed, a simple thought to cling to. The city won't sink. You won't sink. Hold on. They worked for 6 hours. Everyone, even the children, even old woman Pak Usan. Grace directed the dismantling. Yuna took down the defensive towers. Taegil hammered additional fasteners into the modules. Minji prepared the hospital. She tied herbs to the shelves. She closed the shutters. Sonhwa covered the greenhouse with reed mats. Ayun helped everywhere. She ran along the gangways with ropes. She tied down barrels. She secured doors. Emily packed her maps into a leather bag and hid them below deck in a waterproof compartment that Doyeon had built specifically for valuables. Doyeon checked every knot personally, every joint, every rope, every pile. He walked around the city for 5 hours straight. His hands were calloused. His legs were buzzing. His head was calculating. Wind load per square meter. Wave height. Wave period. Roll amplitude. The structure's resonance frequencies. He calculated without a computer, without a calculator, in his head. The numbers floated before his eyes, and he sorted them out like in his college days. The storm hit at 10 o'clock in the evening. First, the wind, cold, strong. Then the rain, a wall of water. Then the waves. The lake reared up. Waves 1.5 meters high rolled in from the west, one after another. The city rose, fell, rose. The platforms creaked, groaned. People in the modules prayed. Children cried. Haeon held Dalsu close and clutched her belly. She was 7 months pregnant. Minji sat next to her and held her hand. Doyon was outside, on the deck, tied to the central mast, which they hadn't taken down because it held a bell. He stood and watched. The wave was coming. The city rose with it. The weakened joints worked like joints. Each platform moved separately but remained part of the whole, like a snake, flexible and inseparable. The wave passed under the city and moved on. There was no impact. The energy dissipated. Doyon stood and counted. Every wave, every creak, every movement. He held a blueprint in his hands, a diagram of the connections. It marked the nodes that might burst first. If the 4th node bursts, the city will split into 2 parts. We'll have to pull it back together. If the 9th bursts, the hospital will drift away. We'll have to send a boat. The blueprint was getting wet in the rain. Doyon pressed it to his chest. 3 hours. 4. 5. The storm didn't let up. The strongest wave came at 2 in the morning. 2 meters. The city plunged so low that water spilled over the deck. Doyon was waist deep. The rope dug into his chest. He spat out the water and looked at the modules. Intact. All intact. Not a single one had been torn off. Not a single one had capsized. The city groaned, but held firm. The storm passed by dawn. The wind died down. The waves subsided. The rain stopped. A gray sky. 2 dim suns. Silence. Doyon stood there, soaked to the skin, tied to the mast with the blueprint in his hands. He hadn't slept all night. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't drunk. He just stood there and counted. Minji was the first to emerge from the module. She looked in around. She walked around the city. All the modules were in place. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone was alive. Not a single casualty. Not a single one washed away. Even the chicken coop that Sun Hyung had built on the rear platform had survived. The chickens were wet and angry, but alive. Minji found Doyon by the mast. He was sitting there, leaning back against it, eyes closed, blueprint in his hands, soaked through. She took off her raincoat, covered him with it. She stood there for a moment. Then she left. The city was waking up. People were coming out of their modules. They looked at each other. They looked at the water. They looked at the sky. Alive. Everyone was alive. Park Woo-sun stepped out into the square and spoke loudly. She said the water had accepted them, that they were now a water people. No one argued. That same day, news came from the shore. Sonnong had fallen. The swarm came on the night of the storm. The walls that had stood for 30 years collapsed in 3 hours. The Jisoo stormed the city at the same time as the Chunpung. The garrison fought to the end. Almost all of Sonnong's hunters were killed. General Che Gang-gu led 3,000 civilians out through the eastern gate. The rest didn't make it. Doyon heard this news from a refugee who had swum to the platforms on a piece of the broken gate. A middle-aged man. One eye was closed, caked with dried blood. He lay on the deck and spoke in the even voice of a man who had already stopped feeling. Sonnong. Fallen. The mainland's last stronghold. Doyon stood and listened. They had been walking for 12 days. 3,000 people on winter roads through territory teeming with Jisoo. 2,300 reached Doyon City. The rest did not make it. Doyon stood at the edge of the platform and looked at the shore. People. Hundreds. Thousands. Standing in the snow and looking at the water. Silent. They had no strength to speak. Women, children, old people, the wounded, the hungry, the frostbitten. And among them, a single man in armor,
tall, upright, with a sword at his belt and a face that betrayed nothing. General Che Ganggu, commander of the Sonyeon hunters. The man who had sent scouts and diplomats to Doyon and a detachment for the occupation. The man who had considered the city on the water a cowardly move. Now he stood on the shore of the ruined fortress and looked at this city. And the city was the only thing still standing. Doyon did not keep him waiting, did not make he ask. He didn't say a single word that could be taken as a reproach. He launched all the boats, 8 of them. He began the evacuation. Women and children first, the wounded second, the elderly third, the men last. Yuna coordinated. Taegil helped on the shore. Grace received people on the platforms and assigned them. Minji set up the hospital. All 3 sections, plus 2 temporary ones on the open decks. Sunhwa distributed food. Everything they had. Dried fish, beans, radishes, supplies they'd stockpiled for winter. Doyon knew he was giving away a month's worth of reserves. He knew they'd go hungry afterward. But 2,300 people were standing in the snow. And this wasn't math. These were people. The transport took 2 days. 2 days of non-stop work. The boats went back and forth, back and forth. Doyon rowed himself. His hands were covered in blood. Chansu rowed beside him, silent as always. Even Taejong rowed, without words, without questions. When the last boat docked at the platform, Doyon sat down on the deck and couldn't stand up for 20 minutes. His legs gave out. Minji came. She rubbed ointment on his legs. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him in a way that made him understand. Enough. You've done your part. Now lie down. 2,432 people. On a structure designed for 200. It was impossible. The platforms had sagged 10 centimeters. The deck was wet from water was spilling over the edges. People were packed together, shoulder to shoulder. There were 3 or 4 people per square meter. The modules were crammed, 10 in each instead of 4. The air was heavy, sour from breath and unwashed bodies. Children were crying. Old people were moaning. The wounded screamed when Minji changed their bandages. It was hell. A quiet, wet hell on the water. Doyon hadn't slept for 3 days. He was building. The system had given him everything it could at the second level. Boards, tar, nails. He took the materials and built, platform after platform. Grace worked side by side with him. Her crew had doubled in size. The refugees from Sonnen were builders, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths. People who had built a fortress for 30 years. They didn't need to be told how to hold an axe. Grace showed them the blueprint. They built. In 3 days, 20 new platforms appeared on the water. Rough, without modules, without decks, just logs and planks. But they floated, and you could sit on them, then lie down, then live. Doyon assigned people to the new platforms. He counted. 20 people here, 30 there, families together, singles with singles. The wounded closer to the hospital. The elderly closer to the center where it was warmer. Children farther from the edge. He knew this was temporary, that 10 times as much was needed. But the people were on the water, not in the snow, not in a field, in the water. On the 4th day after the refugees' arrival, General Che came to Doyon. He came alone, unarmed, without armor, in plain clothes. He stood before Doyon and said nothing. Doyon stood opposite him and waited. Che was older, about 50 years old, a face like an axe. His eyes were tired, dark circles under them. This man had probably slept as little as Doyon. Che said he had not come as a general. There was no general anymore. There was no fortress anymore. There was no army anymore.
He had come as a man with 2,000 people behind him and nowhere to lead them. Doyon listened. Che said he had been wrong, that a city on the water isn't cowardice, that he'd seen how this city had weathered the storm that destroyed Sonnong, that the fortress walls were 3 meters of stone and they'd crumbled, but the planks on the water still stand. He fell silent. Then he said he was asking for refuge, for his people, not for himself, for the people. Doyon looked at him for a long time. Then he held out his hand. Che looked at the hand, at the calluses, at the scraped skin, at the fingers of an engineer who had built not walls but a home. He took the hand, shook it, firmly, and in that moment something broke in his face. Not tears. Che Gonggu wasn't the type to cry. Just for a second, his face became human. Not that of a general. Human. Doyon said there was no need to ask for refuge. There was shelter here for everyone, and that he needed help. Many hands, many minds, much experience. Che nodded. He said he had 2,000 hands, and that they were ready. Doyon said, then we'll start tomorrow. The next 3 weeks were a construction marathon. Doyon slept no more than 4 hours a day. He designed at night. He built during the day. Grace was his right-hand woman. Che became his left. The general turned out to be a brilliant organizer. He divided the refugees into brigades, 20 people each. Each brigade was responsible for its own section. One cuts wood on the shore under the guard of Yuna and the militiamen. Another hauls logs to the water. A third built on the water. A fourth prepared food. A fifth tended to the wounded. A sixth dug up peat. A military organization superimposed on an engineering plan. It worked perfectly. In 3 weeks, the city tripled in size. 60 platforms, 3 rings. The third ring is the outer one, residential, for Sonnen's refugees. Between the second and third rings are bridges, wide ones, planks, not reeds. 3 people can walk side by side on them. Winter modules sprang up like mushrooms. Grace streamlined the process. A standard module, 4 walls, a roof, a stove, a chimney, a door, a window. 4 hours of work by a team of 6 people. 1 module in 4 hours. 4 modules a day. 28 a week. 84 modules in 3 weeks. 336 beds. It wasn't enough. Another 1,800 people slept in tents and under shelters. But it was better than the snow. The system was progressing. Man days were counting in the thousands. 2,400 people. Every day lived. The progress bar toward the third level was no longer moving by millimeters, but by centimeters. Doyon felt that the level was close. 1 more week, maybe 2. Level 3. What would it bring? He didn't know, but he knew he needed more materials, more tools, more possibilities. At level 2, he had built a wooden city. At level 3, maybe he could build a stone one, or a metal one, or something he couldn't yet imagine. Food. The main problem. Sonva worked non-stop. The farms were expanding, 10, 15, 20. But even 20 farms couldn't feed 2,500 people. Fish. We need more fish. Doyon was building new traps, big ones, deep water ones. Yuna took the fishing boats to the southern part of the lake every day. They caught them with nets. Big fish, 20 to 30 kilograms each, enough for a day. But the people were growing weak. Beans were growing, radishes were growing, greens were growing. Slowly. Winter. Even with 2 suns, winter is winter. Doyon counted calories, in his head, every day. A deficit of 300 calories per person.
tolerable. But if it goes on another month, problems will start. Minji confirmed it. Especially the children. They have no reserves. Doyon thought. Then he remembered. The Tehran. A dead Tehran in the shallows. 3 months ago, the bones were left behind. And the meat. Gisu meat. Do they eat it? He asked Taegil. Taegil said gisu meat is poisonous, raw. But if you cook it for a long time, a very long time, 6 or 7 hours, the poison breaks down. The taste is disgusting, but you can eat it. In Sonnen, during the famine years, they cooked it, not because life was good. Doyan nodded. He sent Yoon and 10 people to the shore, to the Chuigi's carcasses that had washed ashore after the winter storm. 23 carcasses. The frost had preserved the meat. They brought it all back. Minji checked it. She nodded. Boil it for 8 hours to be safe. Grace set 3 large pots on 3 stoves. 8 hours of boiling. The smell was so strong that people held their noses. But when Doyon was the first to scoop from the pot and eat a spoonful of the brown sludge, and didn't die, and didn't cringe, and even nodded, then everyone started eating. It tasted like a boiled shoe sole soaked in a swamp. But it was protein. Lots of protein. The calorie deficit was closed in a single day. End of the 8th month. The system flashed. Level 3. Doyon sat on the deck at night. Everyone was asleep. Text before his eyes. Marine construction. Level 3. New materials. Stone blocks. Standard size, 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter. Iron clamps, 50 pieces. Water wheel, 1 piece. Drive power, 1 horsepower. Doyon read and couldn't believe it. Stone, iron, water wheel, mechanical energy. This isn't a wooden city. This is the beginning of a real city. Stone foundations, iron fastenings, and a wheel that can grind grain, or pump water, or turn a lathe. He sat on the deck and laughed. Quietly, alone. For the first time in 8 months. Because for the first time, he saw not survival, but a future. The 9th month, spring. 2 suns rose higher. The ice off the shores was melting. The water in the lake grew lighter. It turned from gray-black to gray-blue. The fish returned. The traps were working again. Sonhwa began the spring planting. All 20 farms were planted, plus 10 new ones. 30 farms. Beans, radishes, green onions, beans. And something new. Grain. Among Sonhwa's seeds was millet. Small, undemanding. It grows in 60 days. If it works out, by summer they'll have porridge. Real porridge, not fish with grass. Porridge. People cried when they found out. Doyon didn't understand why porridge brought tears. Minji explained. Porridge isn't just food. Porridge is normality. It's a morning where everything is fine. People aren't crying from hunger. They're crying from the memory of a time when there was no hunger. The stone blocks changed everything. Doyon started with the foundations. The pile system held, but wood rots. In 2 years, the piles will weaken. Stone doesn't rot. He lowered stone blocks to the bottom and placed wooden piles on top of them. A stone cushion. Load distribution. A block at the bottom. A pile on the block, a platform on the pile, a 3-tiered system, 4 times stronger. He used iron clamps for the joints. Where there used to be rope, there was now iron. Rope rots in 3 weeks. Iron lasts for years. The city ceased to be temporary. The city became permanent. Grace said she now believed it would last 10 years. Doyon said it would last 50. Grace raised an eyebrow. She said that 50 years ago, she wasn't even born yet.
Doyon said that was precisely why they needed to build for 50 years, so that those who weren't born yet would also have a home. A water wheel. Doyon installed it on a pontoon at the southern edge of the city. The current in the lake is weak, but sufficient. The wheel turned slowly. 1 horsepower. Not much, but... He connected the wheel via a system of gears to a millstone. A millstone made from a stone block that he had hewn into a circle over 2 days. A mill. The first water mill. When the millet ripens in 2 months, he'll have something to grind. But until the millet ripens, Doyon found another use for the wheel. He connected it to a pump made of bamboo tubes. The bamboo grew on the eastern shore. Tegil brought 20 stalks. The pump lifted water from the lake to a height of 2 meters and fed it through a trough to the farms. Automatic irrigation. Sunhwa stood and watched as the water poured onto her garden beds all by itself, without human hands. She said it was witchcraft. Doyon said it was hydraulics. Sunhwa said she didn't see the difference. He laughed. She laughed too. For the first time in all the time he'd known her. Population, 2,400. A 3rd ring city, but the 4th ring was already being planned. Doyon was drawing on a large board in the center of the square, every evening, a sketch of the city. Emily stood nearby and transferred his sketches to a map, scale 1 to 500. The city no longer fit on a 1 to 200 scale. The 4th ring would be an outer defensive ring. Between the 3rd and 4th rings, an industrial zone, workshops, a blacksmith shop, a weaving workshop, a pottery workshop, a shipyard. Grace was already building the shipyard, a long platform with a canopy and a slipway. The first real boat was laid on the slipway at the beginning of the 10th month. Not a raft, not a bundle of logs, a boat with a keel, with sides, with oars, with a mast for a sail. Yuna came to the shipyard and stood there for an hour. She just watched. Then she said she wanted 10 of them. Doyon said there would be 20. School. A real school. Not boards with charcoal. A platform with a canopy. Benches made of planks. Emily taught the children. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography. The last subject a strange feeling in Doyon. Emily taught using a map she had drawn herself. A map of the world where cities disappeared faster than she could mark them down. But now there was a city on the water on the map. And it wasn't disappearing. It was growing. Aeon helped Emily. She was the oldest of the students, and also her assistant. She explained to the younger ones what she herself had learned yesterday. Doyon watched her. She was changing. From a chatty girl, she was turning into something else. More composed, quieter. But her eyes burned just as brightly, perhaps even more so. She was building her library. A small platform, 2 by 2 meters, shelves made of bark, scrolls on the shelves. Emily wrote. Sunhwa dictated on agronomy. Minji dictated on medicinal herbs. Grace dictated on carpentry. Ion gathered it all and arranged it on the shelves, and every evening she would sit on her tiny island library and read. Alone, by the light of an oil lamp. The first person in this world to read for pleasure rather than for survival. The first wedding on the water. Kang Jae-ho and a girl from Sunhon named Rin. They met during a construction marathon. He hauled logs. She handed him nails. 3 weeks later, he went to Doyon and said he wanted to get married. Doyon asked if they had a module. Jae-ho hesitated. He said he lived with 5 others. Doyon built them a separate module in 2 days. A small one, for 2, with a window facing east, so the sun would wake them in the morning. The wedding was held in the central square, all 2,400 of them. Minji wove a wreath from greenery gathered from the farms. Sunhwa baked a fish pie, a real one, not that crooked monstrosity Doyon had made for Dalsu. Park Uson sang. Her voice was old and shaky, but the song was beautiful. about water and home. Doyon stood to the side and watched. Yuna was nearby. She wasn't watching the wedding. She was watching Doyon. He didn't notice. The end of the 9th month. A year. The first year. Doyon carved the 365th notch into the central log. A year ago, he died on a bridge in Busan. A year ago, he opened his eyes on the shore of a gray lake. A year ago, there were 6 people on his raft. Now there are 2,500. 3 rings, 60-80 platforms, 30 farms, a mill, a shipyard, a hospital, a school, a library. And every morning an engineer stands on the pier and looks at the water. And the water holds. In the evening there was a celebration in the central square. Nothing lavish, just people sitting together, eating and talking, some laughing, some crying. Grace played something stringed that she'd made from fish guts and a piece of wood. The sound was awful, but everyone clapped, even Taegyu, even General Che. Doyon sat at the edge of the square, Minji beside him, silent, shoulder to shoulder. She turned to him and said one thing, "Happy birthday to the city." Doyon looked at her, at the square, at the people, at the lights reflecting in the dark water, and he thought that this was the best day of his life. In both. The 10th month, the beginning of the 2nd year. Doyon stood on the watchtower and looked out at the lake. The city below him went about its business. The clang of hammers at the shipyard, the laughter of children on the school platform, the smell of fish soup from the kitchen, the splash of oars, the creak of the mill wheel. Sounds that came together as a melody, strange and beautiful. He thought that the time had come, time to think not of the city, of cities, plural. One lake is a single point on the map. If the Gisu find a way to reach it, if the lake runs dry, if something happens that he hasn't foreseen, a single point is a vulnerability. A network is needed. A second city, a third, a fifth, a 10th, on every major lake, in every river delta, in every bay, connected by waterways, trade, exchange, assistance, evacuation if necessary. Not a city, a country, a water country. He showed Emily's plan. She unfolded a large map, a map of the mainland, what remained of the mainland. Lakes, rivers, bays, there were many, dozens of potential points. Emily had marked each one, depth, area, distance from one another, inflowing rivers. Doyon looked at the map and didn't see water. He saw infrastructure, a network, a web. Each node is a city, each thread is a route. Emily asked where to start. Doyon pointed to a lake 150 kilometers to the west, large, deep, with a river flowing into it from the north. The perfect spot for a second city. Emily asked who would build it. Doyon smiled. Not him, his students. He gathered people, not everyone, 20. The best builders Grace had trained, plus 10 volunteers, plus Aeon. He told Aeon she would go with the expedition, not as a builder, as an observer, to record everything, to learn from a distance from the teacher. Aeon turned pale, then she blushed, then she nodded. She was afraid, he could see that, but he saw something else, too. She wanted this. She wanted to prove it, to herself, to him, to everyone, that she could do it. Doyon gave her a scroll with blueprints, the standard set, the first platform, pile foundation, ring beam, water filter, fish trap. Everything he had built in the first month. Only what was written down and drawn. Instructions. Aeon pressed the scroll to her chest and said she wouldn't let him down. Doyon said he knew. Grace gave the expedition a set of tools, real ones. Axes, saws, hammers, iron staples for the first 30 joints, and her personal plumb line, which she used to measure everything. Aeon took the plumb line and promised to return it. Grace said it wasn't a debt, it was a legacy. The expedition left at the beginning of the second week of the 10th month. 31 people, 5 boats. Yuna provided a guard, 6 armed militiamen. Up the river to the north, then on foot to the west. Doyon stood on the dock and watched the boats leave. Emily was beside him. She said Aeon would manage. Doyon said he had no doubt. That was a lie. He doubted it every second. But he knew that if he didn't let his student go, the teacher had lost. The second week of the 10th month brought news. The black banners had returned, Yuna reported. Not 30 people, 100, maybe more. They had set up camp on the southern shore. They had boats, 5, rough ones, but enough to transport people. And fire. They carried burning torches and barrels of something. Tar or oil. Incendiary devices. Doyon listened. He thought. 100 men in 5 boats. If they attack simultaneously from 5 directions, the defenses won't hold. The archers will cover 1 or 2 directions. The other 3 will get through. 5 boats with burning pitch near the wooden city. This is the end. He called for Che. The general came. He listened. His eyes grew cold, professional. He said that with his men there were 70 fighters here, former soldiers of Sonnion, without magic, but with experience. Yuna added 15 militiamen from her guard. 85 fighters, against 100, on the water. The numbers were bad, but not hopeless. Doyon said there was no need to fight. They had to make sure the fight didn't happen. Che looked at him. Yuna looked at him. Both waited. Doyon explained. The city is mobile. The city stands on stilts, but the stilts can be untied. The pontoons are self-propelled if you use oars and sails. The city can be towed. Slowly. But it can be done. If the black banners come at night, they'll come to the shore where the city stood yesterday. And the city won't be there. It will be in the bay, on the northeastern shore of the lake, 2 kilometers away, behind a rocky cape, invisible, inaccessible. Cho blinked. He said that moving a city of 2,500 people in a single night was madness. Doyon said that waiting for them to set it on fire was madness. Yuna said she was in favor of madness. Doyon looked at Chue. Chue was silent for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. He said, "Let's do it." The operation took 6 hours, from sunset until midnight. Doyon coordinated it personally. Phase 1. Untie all the platforms from the piles. 30 teams of 20 people each. Each team has its own platform. Cut the ropes simultaneously at the sound of the bell. 1 strike, 3 strikes. Untied. The city swayed and began to float. Free. Stage 2. Towing. 20 boats tied to the outer ring. 6 rowers in each, plus sails on 4 large platforms. Southwesterly wind. Perfect. The city moved slowly, at a pedestrian's pace, but it moved. Through the dark water, without lights, without a sound. 2,500 people were silent. The children slept. The adults sat in the darkness and listened to the splash of the oars. Stage 3. Arrival. The northeastern bay, shallow water for temporary anchors. No time to drive in new piles. But the rocks on the bottom were suitable. Heavy. Ropes tied to the rocks. A temporary mooring. The city rose. Swayed. Froze. Silence. 2 o'clock in the morning. Doyeon stood on the deck and listened. A distant light shone from the southern shore. Torches. The black banners had arrived. To the empty shore. To the piles sticking out of the water without a city. Doyeon imagined the face of their leader. Not malice, just the satisfaction of an engineer whose plan had worked. Yuna returned from reconnaissance. The black banners had left. Their boats lay empty on the shore. They didn't know where the city had gone. They thought it had sunk, or drifted down the river, or vanished into thin air. A miracle. A curse. The punishment of the gods they themselves had summoned. Yuna said she heard one of them shout that the gods had taken the sinners. Doyeon said the gods had nothing to do with it. Just physics and 20 boats with good rowers. Yuna smiled. The first smile he had seen on her face. Doyeon spent the remaining days of the 10th month on 3 things. First, new piles in the cove. Permanent ones. Stone foundations, iron brackets. The town was settling into its new home. The cove was better than the old one. Deeper, shielded from the wind by cliffs on 3 sides. The entrance was narrow, easy to defend. Doyeon regretted not finding it sooner. Second, a water corridor. A system of connected pontoons from the cove to the river, pontoon to pontoon. A bridge on the water. If they had to evacuate again, people would walk along the pontoons, not in boats, across the bridge. Faster, safer. Third, reconnaissance. Yuna and 10 men surveyed the lake's shores. They marked all the approaches on Emily's map, every spot where they could land, all the shallow waters, all the rocks, a complete defensive map. Emily worked without sleep for 2 days, filling the map with notes. Depth here, current there, a rock here, a shoal, reeds, forest, open shore, closed shore. When she finished, they had a map of the lake's defenses that any general would envy. Cho looked at the map and said that in 30 years in Sonyeon, he had never had a map like this. Emily blushed and said they were just lines on paper. Cho replied that wars are won by lines on paper. Emily blushed even more. The end of the 10th month. A messenger arrived from Aeon, a young man in a boat. He had been sailing down the river for 3 days. He brought a scroll. Aeon wrote that they had made it. They found the lake, a big one, deep, with a river. The first platform has been laid. It stands. It holds. 6 people live on it. The rest are on the shore building the second one. Everything according to the blueprints. There are problems. The reeds are thinner than on their lake. The bottom is muddy. The piles go in too deep. But it's solvable. She figured out how. She shortened the piles and set them on stone cushions made of boulders, just as Doyeon taught. Only the other way around. Not a stone under the pile, but a stone instead of the pile. The boulders lie on the bottom. The platform stands on the boulders. Simple, rough, but it holds. Doyeon read it and smiled. She had solved the problem he hadn't given her. She found the problem herself. She found the solution herself. The wrong one. A temporary one. In 6 months, the boulders will shift and the platform will slide. But it's enough for the first few months. He wrote his reply. He praised the solution. He explained why it was temporary. He suggested a combined option, boulders plus short piles. The messenger swam back. Doyeon stood on the pier and watched the sunset. 2 suns, a year and 10 months, 2 cities, 2,500 people in the first, 31 in the second. 2 dots on the map instead of 1, the beginning of a network. He thought that someday there would be 10 dots, then 20, then 100, and between them there would be not roads but rivers, not walls but water. A new geography, a new world. He thought that this was madness, and that madness is sometimes the only sensible choice. The 11th month, the 2nd year. The city in the bay lived and breathed. 3 rings of platforms, a 4th was under construction. The workshops on the southern edge clanged with hammers from dawn to dusk. The Grace shipyard launched 1 boat a week, real boats, with a keel and a sail. Yuna inspected each one personally, checked the stability, speed, maneuverability. She rejected every 3rd one. Grace cursed. Yuna wouldn't back down. In the end, the fleet consisted of boats that wouldn't capsize even in a storm. 12 vessels, patrol boats, fishing boats, cargo ships. Each had a name. Yuna named the first patrol boat after her deceased partner. No one asked what it was. She didn't say. Sonhwa made a breakthrough. The millet had sprouted. Green, thick, heavy ears. Farm number 12 was completely planted with millet, and on the 28th day, the ears began to fill out. Sonhwa walked between the rows and touched every stalk. She talked to them, quietly, like with children. The other farmers watched and didn't laugh. They had already seen that everything grew better for Sonhwa than for the others. Maybe because she talks to them. Maybe because she knows when to water and when not to. Maybe because her hands remember 100 years of family farming. They harvested the first crop of millet on the 60th day. 4 sacks, small ones, but it was grain. The mill ground it into flour in an hour. Coarse, gray, with husks, but flour. Sonhwa brought Doyon a flatbread, hot, gray, smelling of smoke and lake water. Doyon took a bite, chewed for a long time, swallowed, looked at Sonhwa. She stood there, waiting, hands in the earth, eyes huge. He said it was the best flatbread he'd ever eaten. Sonhwa nodded. She took the remaining piece and carried it to the children. Doyon watched her go and thought that this 19-year-old girl had just fed the city with grain, on water, where grain shouldn't grow. But it does, because Sonhwa told it to grow. The 12th month. Che came to Doyon with a proposal. He spoke at length and in detail, like a general at a war council. The gist was simple. The city had grown. 2,500 people. Authority was needed. Not a single person who decides everything. A council. Representatives from each ring. From the workshops, from the farms, from defense, from the hospital. Doyon listened. He knew this conversation was coming. He'd known since the first month. One person cannot run a city. He is an engineer, not a ruler. He builds structures, not political systems. Che proposed a structure, a council of 9 people. Doyon as the founder, Che as head of defense, Grace as head of construction, Minji as head of health, Sonhwa as head of food, Yuna as head of the fleet, Emily as head of archives and education, Taegyu as head of the Coast Guard, and 1 elected representative from the residents. Doyon asked who would be the head of the council. Che looked at him. He said it was obvious. Doyon shook his head. He said the head of the council should be the elected representative. Not him, not Che. The person the residents choose. Che frowned. He said it was risky. They might choose Taejun. Doyon said that if they chose Taejun, it meant Taejun was needed. Che was silent. Then he nodded. Slowly, like a man learning something new at 50. The election was held a week later.
In the central square, every resident over 16 could vote. A pebble into a wooden bowl. 3 candidates. Taejun, a woman named Da-som, a former resident of Sonyeon, and Baek Changsu. Changsu didn't want to. Doyeon asked him to. He said the people needed a choice, not 2 votes, but 3. Changsu agreed with the look of a man being led to his execution. They chose Da-som, a quiet woman in her 40s, a widow, 3 children. She worked on farms, and everyone knew her because she remembered the name of every child in town. Every single one. Taejung received 200 votes, Chansu 100, Da-som 1,400. Taejung looked at the result. He pursed his lips. Then he walked over to Da-som and bowed. He congratulated her. He left. Doyeon watched. Taejung didn't break. He didn't get bitter. He accepted it. Maybe for the first time in his life, he accepted that he wasn't the one making the decisions. Maybe that's what growth is. Not of the city, of a person. The council met that same evening. 9 people on the central platform. Doyeon sat and listened. Da-som presided over the meeting, in a quiet voice, without fanfare. The agenda: summer supplies, farm expansion, construction of the 4th Ring Road, a waterway to the 2nd city, defense of the southern shore. Everyone spoke on their respective areas. Grace on construction, Yuna on the fleet, Sonhwa on the harvest, Minji on health, Chue on defense, Taegil on the coast, Emily on school and maps, Doyeon on engineering plans. Da-som listened to everyone. She asked questions, not silly ones, precise ones. When the 4th module would be ready. How much flour per month? Would there be enough medicine? Doyeon realized they had made the right choice. Da-som didn't build. She didn't fight. She didn't heal. She remembered people. And a city is people. The 13th month, summer of the 2nd year. Heat. 2 suns scorched the deck so that one couldn't walk barefoot. Doyeon stretched canvas awnings over all the decks. Shade. People walked under the awnings as if on covered streets. The city began to resemble an Eastern bazaar. The only thing missing was merchants. Although merchants did appear as well. A connection was established between the 1st and 2nd cities. A boat with cargo every 10 days. Grain and tools going there. Different kinds of fish and stone coming back. The 2nd city stood on a lake with a rocky bottom. Stone was easier to extract there. Exchange, trade, economy. Doyeon watched this and thought that civilization doesn't begin with walls. It begins with exchange. When one city gives another what it lacks, and receives what it lacks. A simple idea, as ancient as humanity itself. But out on the water, it sounded like a revelation. Aeon sent a long letter. The 2nd city was growing. 70 people, 8 platforms, 1 farm. There were problems. Conflict between the expedition's builders and the local refugees who arrived later. The locals wanted to build their own way. The expedition team wanted to follow Doyeon's blueprints. Aeon stood between them and said that the blueprints were the foundation, but adaptation to local conditions was necessary. She allowed the locals to change the shape of the canopies. They made a pitched roof instead of a flat one. It rained more often and harder here. The pitched roof worked better. Aeon wrote that at first she was afraid to deviate from the blueprint. Then she realized that a blueprint isn't a law. A blueprint is the start of a conversation. Doyeon read it and felt something warm spreading through his chest. She was learning, not to build, to think. That was more important. Midsummer. Something was happening at the bottom of the lake. Doyeon was the first to notice. The water in the center of the bay grew warmer, by 2 degrees, then by 4, then by 6.
The fish left the center. The farms standing over the deep water began to grow faster. The substrate was warming from below. Songfa said it was good for the harvest, but bad for her nerves. The water shouldn't warm from below.
This isn't right. Doyeon dived 3 times with a rope and a stone weight. The depth in the center of the bay is 12 meters. At 6 meters, he felt the heat. At 8 meters, it was scorching. At 10, he turned back because the water was burning his skin. Something at the bottom was generating heat. He remembered. The lake core. The warm stone he'd found in the trap during the 3rd week. The one he'd built into the foundation. The one that had strengthened the structure by 40%. At the bottom of the lake lay whatever that these stones came from. Something big. Alive. Or not quite alive, but active. And it was waking up. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. He needed to understand. He retrieved the 2nd core from the trap 2 days later, and the 3rd one a week later. The stones rose from the bottom on their own, like bubbles, warm, pulsating. The system reacted to each one. Lake core detected, level unknown. Application, structural reinforcement, embed in the foundation. Doyeon embedded them, each stone into a new pile. The city's strength grew. But he understood that the stones were not a gift. The stones were an invitation. That something at the bottom wanted the city to grow, wanted Doyeon to build more, faster, deeper. Why? He didn't know, and it kept him awake. The end of the 13th month. The population of the first city was 2,800. People had joined from small settlements who had heard of Zonnen's fall and realized that the land was no longer an option. The second city had 70. The third was laid out, on the river 100 kilometers to the north. The 14th month. The end of summer in the 2nd year. The water in the center of the bay continued to heat up, already 10 degrees above normal. Steam rose in the mornings, thin, white. Beautiful, if you didn't know the reason. The children thought it was fog. The adults did too. Only Doyeon knew it wasn't fog. It was a breath. Something at the bottom was breathing. And with each passing day, it breathed louder. He told the council, gathered all 9 of them, showed them the cores, told them about the heat at the bottom, about how the stones were rising on their own, about how it started when the city grew to a certain size. The council listened. Che frowned. Yuna put her hand on her crossbow. Minji asked if it was dangerous for people. Doyeon said, not yet, as long as it's warm. Warmth is good for the farms, good for life. But he didn't know what would happen next. Grace asked directly, what's down there? Doyeon said he didn't know, but he was going to find out. He'd been building a submersible for 2 weeks. Not a submarine, simpler. A bell. A diving bell. A wooden barrel 2 meters high and 1 meter in diameter, open at the bottom, closed at the top, filled with air. The principle is simple. An upside-down glass in water doesn't fill up. The air inside keeps the water out. A person inside the bell can breathe. Not for long, 20 minutes, but enough to go down to the bottom and take a look. Grace helped build it. She coated every seam with resin. She checked the buoyancy. Negative. The bell sinks. Slowly. That's right. It's supposed to sink. Controlled. A rope at the top. A winch on the platform. Lower it. Wait. Raise it. Doyeon climbed in himself. No one argued. Everyone knew it was pointless. Minji said only one thing. 20 minutes. Not a second more. If he doesn't pull the rope in 20 minutes, she'll pull it up. Doyeon nodded. He climbed into the bell. Cramped.
dark, the smell of resin and wet wood. Grace lowered him. The rope unwound. 1 meter. 2. 3. The water behind the bell's walls grew darker. 5 meters. His ears popped. 6. 7. Warm. The water behind the walls was warm. 8. Hot. 9. The bell touched the bottom. A soft thud. Silt rose in a cloud. Doyon waited. The cloud settled, and he saw ruins. Not rocks, not stones. Walls. Stone walls. Smooth, hewn, with masonry, with arches, with window openings. A flooded city. An entire district. Houses, streets, squares. Everything covered in silt and algae. But the outlines were clear. It was a city. A real city. Built by people. 200 years ago or earlier. Before the Gisu. Before the catastrophe. Someone lived here. At the bottom of a lake that wasn't a lake back then. Doyon looked through the open bottom of the bell. The water was murky, but a warm light shone from below, from the center of the ruins. Golden, steady, like from a lamp. It came from a building, a large one, with columns, a temple, or a palace, or something else. The light pulsed, slowly, like a heartbeat. Doyon counted the pulse. 60 beats per minute. A human rhythm. He tugged the rope. Once. A signal. Lift. Everyone was waiting for him on the surface. Minji, Yuna, Grace, Chue, Sonhwa, Emily, Tegel, Dasam. He climbed out of the bell, wet and shivering, not from the cold, from what he had seen. He told them. Everything. The ruins of the city at the bottom, the light from the building with columns, pulsing in the rhythm of a human heart. The council was silent. Then Chue said they needed to go down again, with weapons. Doyon shook his head. He said weapons would be useless down there. There is no enemy there. Something is waiting there, and it isn't waiting for a battle. It is waiting for him. Emily asked how he knew. Doyon said that the stones were rising toward his traps, not toward strangers, toward his. The warmth intensified as the city grew. His city. Something at the bottom is reacting to him, to what he's building. Minji put her hand on his shoulder. She said she'd go with him. Doyon looked at her. He wanted to say no. He couldn't, because there was something in her eyes you don't argue with. The second dive. 2 bells. Grace had built the second one in 3 days. Doyon and Minji, side by side, on ropes. They descended in sync. 10 meters, the bottom. Ruins. Light. They walked along the bottom, slowly. It was hard, the water resisted. The bells hung over them like strange helmets. Doyon held Minji's hand, not because she was afraid, because he was afraid. They reached a building with columns. The entrance was open, wide, tall. Light streamed from inside, golden, warm, like the morning sun. Doyon peered inside. A hall, huge, the ceiling 10 meters above their heads, the walls covered with reliefs. People, water, platforms. The reliefs depicted a city on the water, circular platforms, bridges, trusses, boats, just like Doyon's, exactly the same. 200 years ago, someone had already built the very same thing, here, in this very spot. Doyon stared at the reliefs and couldn't breathe. In the center of the hall stood a pillar, stone, 3 meters tall. It glowed.
Light and warmth radiated from it, and there were words on the pillar. Doyon couldn't read them underwater, but he could see they were there, carved into the stone, and he recognized one word, because it wasn't written in the local language. It was written in Korean, in Hangul, one word among hundreds of foreign ones. Engineer. He tugged on the rope twice. Quickly, pull him up. On the surface he was shaking. Minji was too. She saw the same thing he did. Reliefs, with a city on the water. A lighted pole, a Korean word. She looked at Doyon and said that someone had been here before him, someone from his world. Doyon nodded. He'd been thinking about it since day one. The system in his head, marine construction, a Korean interface, lake cores. None of this was a coincidence. Someone had created this system for someone specific, for an engineer, for someone who builds on water. And that someone had done it 200 years ago, here, at the bottom of this lake. That night, Doyon didn't sleep. He sat on the pier and thought. Minji sat beside him, silently. She knew how to be silent beside him, so that the silence was not empty, but full, like water. He told her, for the first time, that he wasn't from this world, that he had died in another world and woke up here, that there was a system in his head that helped him build, that he was an engineer from a place called Korea, that everything he knew about water and structures he knew before he came here. Minji listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask questions. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said she knew. Not everything, not the details, but she knew he wasn't from here, from the very first day, because he looked at things the way no one else does, as if he were seeing them for the first time and yet knew everything about them at the same time. She said it didn't matter to her where he was from. What mattered was that he was here. Doyon looked at her. The moon was reflected in the water. He took her hand. She didn't pull it away. They sat like that until dawn, in silence, hand in hand. An engineer and a doctor, on the pier of a city that shouldn't exist. The 15th month. The water in the center of the bay began to move. Not waves, not a current. A rotation, slow, barely noticeable. A vortex, small, about 3 meters in diameter. It appeared at dawn and disappeared by noon. Every day a little larger than the last, 3 meters, 4, 5. On the 6th day, 10. People noticed. Children pointed. Adults moved away from the edge. Taegyul posted lookouts at the vortex. Yuna sent out patrol boats. Che put the garrison on alert. Doyon stood at the edge of the platform and looked down. The funnel was spinning, slowly, hypnotically. And at the bottom of the funnel, light was breaking through the murky water. Golden. Familiar. A pillar. It was rising. Doyon realized there was little time. Whatever was happening at the bottom was coming to the surface, and when it emerged, the city had to be ready. For what? He didn't know. But the city had to be ready for anything. He convened the council, an emergency meeting. He explained what he saw. The funnel, the light, something rising. He didn't know what. Didn't know if it was friend or foe, but they had to prepare for both possibilities. Che suggested an evacuation. Get people out of the central platforms. Move them to the bay, away from the funnel. Doyon agreed. Yuna suggested combat boats along the perimeter, crossbows at the ready. Minji ramped up the hospital to full capacity. Songhua harvested the crops early, everything she could. Grace reinforced the outer rings. Emily drew up an evacuation plan, routes, assembly points, boarding order for the boats. Aeon received a message, to be ready to take people in if necessary. 3 days of preparation. Doyon worked non-stop. He slept 2 hours a day. Minji made him eat. He would forget. She would bring a bowl of porridge and set it down next to him. He ate without looking, with one hand. The second one drew up plans for the evacuation bridges. The water corridor to the second city was completed. 200 pontoons linked together in a chain. You could walk across them. 1,000 people an hour. If necessary, the entire city could evacuate in 3 hours, by water, on foot, without boats, without panic. Doyon inspected every pontoon personally. The 16th month, the beginning of the second summer. The vortex had grown to 30 meters. The city had moved back. The central platforms had been towed to the edge of the bay. In the place of the city center was now open water with a spinning vortex in the middle. The light from the depths grew brighter. At night, it illuminated the water from below, and the city floated above a golden glow. Beautiful. Terrifying. The children didn't sleep. Neither did the adults. At dawn on the 17th day of the 16th month, the water in the center of the funnel began to drain downward, abruptly, like into a sink drain. The lake level dropped 0.5 meter in an hour. The platform settled into the shallows near the bay's shores. A screech. A crack. The piles struck the bottom. The city tilted. People screamed. Doyon stood at the edge and watched. Something was rising from the funnel. First he saw a stone, wet, gray, covered in algae. Then a column, stone, carved. Then a wall. Then a roof. A tower. A stone tower rose from the water like a hand from a grave. Slowly. Inevitable. Water cascaded down it in waterfalls. Seaweed hung down like hair. The tower grew and grew. 5 meters above the water, 10, 15. It stopped at 20. And on the tower's balcony stood a man. Doyon saw him from 200 meters away. The man stood upright, calm, in clothes Doyon had never seen in this world. A long robe, dark, with patterns, long hair, gray, an old face, but the eyes. Even from 200 meters away, Doyon could see that the eyes were alive, bright, young in an old face. The man was looking at the city, at the platforms, at the people, at Doyon, and Doyon felt that gaze like a spotlight on his skin. Then the man spoke. His voice carried over the water as if on a wire. Clear, distinct, every word like a stone set in place. He spoke Korean, with Doyon's accent, with that very Pusan drawl that Doyon had heard his whole life. He said, "Han Doyon, I've been waiting for you for 187 years. I'm sorry it took so long." Silence. Absolute. 2,800 people were silent. Minji stood next to Doyon, her hand on his shoulder. Yuna raised her crossbow, aimed it at the figure on the balcony, fingers on the trigger. Emily dropped her notebook. It fell onto the deck and opened to a map of the city. Songhua hugged the nearest pot of seedlings, pressed it close to her, like a child. Gray S stood with a pickaxe in her hands. She froze. Then she whispered a single word. Che placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. He didn't draw it. He just placed his hand there. Tegil stood on the watchtower and didn't move. Ion. Ion was in the second city, but if she were here, she would have said it aloud. Master, who is that? And Doyon would have answered just as he had in his own imagination. He doesn't know, but it seems this man knows him. Doyon stood on the pier. He looked at the tower, at the man on the balcony, and he felt the system in his head expanding wider than ever before. New text. Not a line, a page. Dozens of lines. Marine construction. Level. Unlimited. Access. Open. Source.
The first builder. Connection established. Doyon blinked. He read it again. The first builder. The man on the tower. He created the system. He created it 187 years ago. For the one who would come after him. For the engineer. Doyon lowered his hand. Yuna looked at him. He shook his head. Don't shoot. Yuna lowered her crossbow, slowly, without taking her fingers off the trigger. Doyon took the boat, alone. He rowed toward the tower through the flowing water and floating seaweed. 200 meters felt like an hour. He pulled up to the base of the tower. Stone steps led upward, wet, slippery. He climbed. Every step echoed in the tower's emptiness. At the top, a balcony, and a man. Up close, he looked old, very old, skin like parchment. But his hands. Doyon looked at his hands. Calluses, scraped fingers, splinters. The hands of a builder. The hands of an engineer. Just like Doyon's. The man smiled. He said his name was Park Jong-soo, that he was a bridge engineer from Seoul, that he had come to this world 187 years ago, that he had built the first city on the water, here, on this lake, that the city stood for 60 years and fell, not because of the Jisoo, because of people, who didn't understand why water was needed, who wanted to return to dry land, who destroyed what he had spent his whole life building. Jong-soo couldn't stop them. And then he went down to the bottom, sealed himself in the tower, with the help of the system he created with his last ounce of strength, and waited. Waited for the one who would come and build it again. That's right. Not for himself, for the people. Doyon listened. Standing on the tower's balcony above the water, he listened to the old man who had been waiting for him for nearly 2 centuries. Then he asked one thing. Jisoo, is it him? Chonsu fell silent. Then he said no, not him. But he knew they would come. 5 years before they appeared, he found a fissure at the bottom, a crack in the earth from which energy flowed. The very energy from which he created the system, and the cores, and everything else. This energy attracted the Jisoo. They came for it, like moths to a flame, from the depths of the earth. Chonsu tried to seal the fissure. He couldn't. Too deep, too powerful. But he realized one thing. Water extinguishes this energy. Chonsu lived, barely. The system he created had kept his body going for 187 years, but his body was at its limit. He told Doyon he had a month, maybe 2. Then the system would let go, and he would pass away. He spoke of it calmly, like an engineer discussing a structure's lifespan, without sorrow, without fear, with precision. Doyon brought him to the city, to the platform. People stared at the old man as if he were a ghost. Che placed his hand on his sword and didn't remove it for 3 days. Yuna didn't take her eyes off him. Tae-gil stood nearby with an axe. Min-ji examined Jong-soo, silently, for a long time. Then she told Doyon that the old man wasn't sick. He was simply coming to an end, like a candle, evenly and quietly. There was nothing to be done, only to give him time. Jong-soo taught 4 hours every day. He couldn't do more than that. He'd get tired. He'd sit down on the platform and close his eyes. Then he'd open them again and continue. He taught Doyon what the system didn't provide, what was in the old man's head, not in the interface. How to read a fault line, where the energy lines run underwater. How to place the cores so that they don't just reinforce the structure, but redirect the energy. Downward, toward the fault line, sealing it off. Every core in the city's foundation isn't just reinforcement, it's a patch over a crack in the earth. A city on water is a dual-purpose engineering structure, a home above, a seal below. Doyon listened and took notes. Emily took notes too, every word, every diagram. Aeon received copies via courier. Chonsu told a story, his own. He ended up here just like Doyon, died in Seoul, a car accident, like Doyon. Opened his eyes on the shore of a lake, like Doyon. Received the system, like Doyon. Built a city, like Doyon. Only he made a mistake. He built for himself, not for the people. He was a genius, a lonely genius. He didn't teach, he didn't pass it on, he didn't share. His city depended on him alone. When the people grew tired of waiting for him to solve every problem, they left, and the city collapsed, because without Jongsu, it couldn't stand. Jongsu said that Doyon had done what he hadn't been able to. Doyon didn't build a city, he built the people who build the city. Grace, Yuna, Sonhwa, Ayon, Che. Each of them could carry on without Doyon. Doyon's city does not depend on Doyon. That is true engineering. Doyon sat and listened to the old man and felt tears running down his cheeks. Not out of pity, out of recognition. Chongsu was him, the person he could have become if he had shut himself off, if he had built alone, if he hadn't trusted, if he hadn't let Ion go on the expedition, if he hadn't given Grace control of production, if he hadn't let Che organize the people. Chongsu saw his tears. He smiled. He said there was no need to cry for an old man who had lived 200 years and seen what he wanted to see. Doyon wiped his face. He asked what he had wanted to see. Chongsu looked at the city, at the platforms, at the people, at the children running across the footbridges, at the smoke from the furnaces, at the greenery on the farms, at the boats at the pier, and he said one word. This. For 3 weeks, Chongsu worked with Doyon on the main project, sealing the fault. Not temporarily, permanently. The system Chongsu created could seal the crack in the earth forever, but that would require more than one lake, a network. Cities on the water above every major fault, cores in the foundations, connected by energy lines through waterways. A web. If all the faults were sealed, the Giisu would stop coming out. Not immediately, gradually, in 10 years, in 20, but they would stop. Forever. Doyon looked at the diagram they had drawn together. A map of the continent. 12 lakes, 12 cities, 12 seals, 12 faults. Seal them all, and the world would be healed. He showed the map to Emily. She looked. She looked at Chonsu. She looked at Doyon. Then she took out a blank sheet of paper and began to draw. A new map. A map of the future. 12 points, 12 cities. Lines connecting them. Waterways, trade routes, evacuation corridors. Not a map of survival. A map of civilization. The end of the 2nd year. Chonsu was growing weaker. He no longer got up. He lay on the platform that Doyon had built especially for him. A small one, with a canopy, overlooking the city. Minji sat beside him. She changed his compresses, gave him water. Chonsu looked at the city and smiled. Every day, every hour, he looked and smiled. Early in the morning on the 7th day of the 3rd week, he called for Doyon. Doyon came. He sat down beside him. Chonsu took his hand. The old man's hands were cold, almost icy, but his grip was firm. He said he was passing it on. Everything. The system. Knowledge. Cores. The energy he had been storing for 187 years. Doyon felt something surge into him through his palm. Warmth, light, data, blueprints, maps, schematics. Everything Chonsu had known over 2 centuries. An avalanche. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the system in his head looked different. Not a line of text. Space. 3-dimensional. With models. With calculations. With forecasts. Marine engineering. Level. Unlimited. Full access. Chonsu let go of his hand, lay down, closed his eyes, smiled, and stopped breathing, quietly, like a candle. Minji checked his pulse. She shook her head. They buried him in the water. Doyon lowered the body himself, in a diving bell, to the bottom, to the ruins of the city that Chonsu had built 200 years ago. He laid him in the hall with columns, by the pillar that no longer glowed. The light was gone. Into Doyon. He climbed up, stood on the platform, wet. He was silent. The whole city was silent. 2,800 people stood on the decks and looked at the water. At the spot where the man who had waited for them all for 187 years had gone to the bottom. Grace took off her hat. Tegil bowed his head. Cho took his hand off his sword. For the first time in a month, Yuna stood at the stern of the rowboat and looked into the water. Her face was still, but her hands were trembling. Sonhua placed a wreath of greenery from the farms on the water. The wreath swayed and floated toward the center, where the tower was. The tower sank beneath the water just as slowly as it had risen. Back, into the darkness, into the silence, into the lake that keeps its secrets. The 3rd year, spring. Doyon stood on the pier and looked at the city he had built. 4 rings, 90 platforms, 3,200 people. Workshops, farms, a shipyard, a school, a hospital, a library, a mill, a smithy, a pottery workshop, a weaving workshop. A city on the water that lived and breathed and grew every day. Morning light fell on the decks. Steam rose from the kitchen stoves. Children ran to school across the bridges, their footsteps tapping on the planks like rain. The mill wheel creaked. Boats set out to fish. Sonfa walked between the garden beds and talked to the millet. Grace stood at the shipyard and yelled at the apprentice who had installed the A-frame. Minji carried a basket of herbs to the hospital. Emily sat in school and drew a map of the world for the children. A big one. A beautiful one. With cities on the water marked by blue circles. 3 circles. Soon there would be 4. Then 5. The network was growing. 5 cities. The first one here, 3,200. The second on the western lake, Aeon, 400 people. The third on the northern river, 200. The fourth at the river mouth near the coast, 100. The fifth on a small lake between them, 50. A transshipment station, a warehouse, a waterway junction. Doyon laid the foundation for each one personally. He would drive up, lower the first core into the water, drive in the first pile, and drive away, leaving behind the people he had trained. Grace grumbled that he was spreading himself too thin. Doyon said he was sowing seeds. Grace said she was a carpenter, not a farmer. Doyon said there was no difference, and Grace fell silent because he was right. Ione returned, for the first time in 5 months. She sailed in by boat through the waterway. Doyon stood on the pier and watched her climb onto the platform. She had changed. She was tanned. She had lost weight. Her hands were calloused. Her eyes were different, not girlish, mature. She had built a city, 400 people, 8 platforms, 2 farms, a small hospital, and a library. Of course, a library. The first after housing. She stood before Doyon and reported, clearly, point by point, population, supplies, structures, problems, solutions. He listened and saw himself in her, a year ago, only younger and bolder. She asked for permission to establish a 6th city, on a lake 200 kilometers to the south, a large one, a deep one, above one of the 12 faults on the Chunsu map. Doyon asked how many people she needed. Ion said 40. Doyon said, take 60. She smiled, widely, bowed, ran to Grace for tools. Grace grumbled but gave her the best ones. The summer of the 3rd year, Doyon built the first offshore platform, not on a lake, on a river. At the mouth, where the river meets the sea. Salt water. Different currents, different loads, different hydrodynamics. But the system worked here too. Marine construction, unlimited scope. The materials Chunsu had given him included things Doyon could never have dreamed of before. Stone blocks reinforced with core energy, iron that didn't rust in salt water, ropes made of fiber that didn't rot. He built the platform at the river mouth for 3 weeks, alone, with a crew of 20 people trained by Grace. The platform stood on the waves like a float, sturdy, confident, seafaring, the first step into the open sea. Doyon stood on it and looked at the horizon. Endless gray water, a place no Gisu could ever reach. Never. Autumn of the 3rd year, the 6th city was founded, Ion. The 7th was in progress. Che led the expedition personally. The general who had defended stone walls for 30 years was now building on water. He did it methodically, in a military fashion, precisely, without unnecessary words. His city grew faster than the others because Che knew how to organize people. Doyon looked at the map. 7 dots. 7 cities. 4,800 people on the water. 5 rifts sealed with cores. 7 remained. Gisu began to appear less frequently in the sealed territories. They hadn't disappeared, but less often. Tegel reported that not a single Terran had been seen on the shore in the last month. Not a single one. For the first time in 200 years. Winter of the 3rd year. Mild. Short. The 2 suns shone a little longer than last year. Maybe the world was changing. Maybe it was a coincidence. Doyon didn't speculate. He built. The 8th city. The 9th. Each one over a fault line. Each with cores in the foundation. Each like a patch on the Earth's wound. People came. Not refugees. Settlers. They chose water. Not out of fear. Out of hope. It's better on the water. It's safer on the water. On the water there is food and shelter and school and a doctor and law and a future. Taejong became the foreman of the weaving workshop. He worked quietly. Well, he didn't give orders. He worked. He found his place. Baek Chung-soo got married to a woman from Sunyeon. Quiet, strong. They lived in a module on the 2nd ring, and every morning they broke the ice together, out of habit, even when there was no ice. Hae-young gave birth. A girl. On the platform. At Minji's hospital. Minji delivered the baby herself. Doyon sat outside on the bridge and listened. When the first cry rang out, he closed his eyes. The first child born in the city on the water. She won't know what it's like to run from monsters. She won't know what a burning village is. She won't know what hunger is, or fear, or walls crumbling. For her, the world is water, and the deck, and the bridges, and laughter, and the morning light on the waves. Haeyeon named her Su-ah, Waterflower. Dalsu peeked into the hospital and looked at his sister. Tiny, red, screaming. He said she was loud. Minji said that all good babies are loud. Doyeon stood in the doorway and watched. Minji turned around. Their eyes met. She smiled. He smiled. Then he went out and went to build. Because Sua needs a platform. A small one, with railings, with a view of the sunrise, so that the first thing she sees in the morning is the sun on the water. The dawn of the 4th year. 10 cities, 7,000 people. 10 rifts closed. 2 remained. The Gisu had almost vanished from the closed territories. In the open ones they still roamed, but less often, quieter, hungrier. Like a fire cut off from oxygen. It still burns, but is already dying out. Doyeon knew it would take time. 2 years, maybe 3, maybe 5. But the direction was right. Every closed rift meant fewer creatures, fewer deaths, fewer people fleeing, more life. He built, every day, from morning till night, not alone, with 1,000 people. Grace trained 60 master carpenters. Each could build a city from scratch. Sonhwa trained 20 agronomists. Each could feed 100. Yuna built a fleet of 50 boats and trained 30 captains. Minji trained 12 doctors. Emily published the first textbook, handwritten, 50 pages, mathematics and geography. Ion built the 6th city, which had already become the 3rd largest in the network. Summer of the 4th year, the 11th city, the last rift on land. Doyeon went alone, far away, to the west, across 3 lakes and 2 rivers. By waterways his people had built over 2 years. Pontoon bridges, river canals, channels cleared of debris. A waterway across the mainland. He reached it in 10 days. The lake was small, deep, dark. The rift beneath it was strong. The water was warm, almost hot. He needed a lot of heartstones. 12. He spent 2 days placing them, each in its own spot, according to Chonsu's plan. The city here would be small, a sentry post, but the rift would be sealed. Autumn of the 4th year, the 12th fault, the last one. Under the sea, in a bay on the southern coast. That's where Doyeon brought the first maritime city, Toad. The platform he had built at the river mouth, expanded, reinforced, with a crew of 40. They set out into the open sea, the first people in 200 years to leave the land voluntarily. The ocean waves rocked the platform, but the platform held, as always, because it was designed not to resist, but to move with the waves. Doyeon lowered the last core into the sea. It sank to the bottom, settled into place. The system in his head flashed, brightly, like the sun. 12 out of 12. All fractures sealed. The seal is complete. He stood on the platform in the middle of the sea. Water stretched to the horizon all around. Behind him lay the mainland, with 12 cities and a network of waterways and thousands of people who lived on the water and were not afraid. The wind ruffled his hair, salt spray on his face. 2 suns were warming him. He thought of Chonsu, of the old man who had waited for him for 187 years, who had created the system and died with a smile when he saw that it worked. He thought of Minji, who was waiting for him at home, at the pier, as always, silently, with her hand on his shoulder. He thought of Grace, who was now building the 13th city, not over the rift,
just for people, because people need a home. He thought of Yoon, who patrols the waterways and keeps danger at a safe distance. He thought of Sunway, who feeds 7,000 people with grain grown on water. He thought of Emily, who is drawing a map of the new world, not an empty one, a full one, with blue circles instead of black crosses. He thought of Aeon, who is building her own city, and will soon build better than him. He thought of Che, who found a new war, a war against construction that can be won. He thought of Dalsu, who goes to school and wants to become a sailor. He thought of Sua, who will never know what it means to run. Doyon turned toward the shore, distant, barely visible. There stood his world, a world he had built with his own hands. From logs and stone and iron and stubbornness and sleepless nights and wet blueprints and bitter radishes and lopsided pies and quiet evenings on the pier. A world where water holds. Water always holds, if the load is distributed correctly. He sat down on the deck. He closed his eyes. The sun warmed his face. A wave rocked the platform. Steadily, calmly, like a cradle. He thought he wanted to go home, to his pier, to his people, to Minzy, to porridge and fish pie, to the creak of the mill and the laughter of children, to the clang of hammers and the splash of oars. He opened his eyes. He stood up. He grabbed the tiller. He turned the platform toward the shore, and he rowed home.